Was the question that even though he had two good eyes, a well-sighted man is no better than a blind man when he fails or refuses to see. What's the good of having eyes when you're no better than the blind man?
Core theme of Oedipus, Tyrannus, right? Tiresias sees more clearly without his eyes, and Oedipus, once he sees, takes out his eyes. And of course, the Sphinx is a recurring character in it, with the question of vision. What you're talking about, Stephen, is just dead center in the concerns for the ancient Greeks.
I have been thinking about it for a long time.
Yeah, this is the core stuff. So let's introduce us again this week. The recording is going. This is our Kenneth Smith philosophy seminar. We're doing our series about the forthcoming book, Millennia in Microcosm, which is based on a magazine column, End Times, that came out around the year 2000 in the Comics Journal. We are in chapter 4, Ancient Civilization. We just last week wrapped up section A, which was Nature as Becoming and as Intrinsic Truth. Just Kenneth's first attempt to get us jarred loose from our modern assumptions about the world by showing how the Greeks saw nature and saw truth as being completely intertwined and almost the same thing. He talked about kata phusei, according to nature, as being, this, for the Greeks, this was the fundamental establishment that something was, absolutely verified. If it is that way in nature, then it is true, regardless of our logic, regardless of our laws and our mathematics and our economies and all the clever things we do. Nature wins, which, years, centuries, millennia later, Kafka was going to quote when he said, in the contest between yourself and the world, back the world. So having established that as a fundamental precept of the ancient Greeks and specifically of the ancient worldview, in part B, he's going to take a next step. And the next step is about why the Greeks were aristocratic and philosophical. What did they think they were doing by being aristocratic and philosophical? And this goes to the question that Stephen was talking about before we started recording, which is the question, how can it be that evolution decided, it doesn't decide anything, but there's a certain teleology to the creatures in hindsight, to the organisms that succeed. How is it that it is a successful recipe to have evolved an animal for whom, if we go with Hegel and Smith, two different forms of idiocy make up the baseline metabolism of the mind? The basic faculties of the mind are both forms of idiocy, according to the Greeks. And how can that possibly be adaptive? I mean, it seems crazed, right? Because, to a modern, to be an idiot is to be stupid, i.e. to be bad. Everyone wants to be smart and they want to be good. And so the idea that idiocy is born into us, and what exactly idiocy is, this is a whole fertile area for driving a wedge between the modernist worldview and the ancient worldview. They saw these as meaning radically different things than we do. And the Greek the ancient understanding specifically of idiocy is what drove them to become aristocrats and philosophers. So we're gonna get into this. So if you're wondering, what are we doing on this subject when the previous subject was about the nature of nature? The answer is, you remember Heraclitus has that line about the nature around us and the nature within us. The nature within us, that we are amphibians who stand between two worlds. And one world is the external world, in which things are subtly but detectably operating according to the principles of nature, the archai. But inside of us, we have human nature at work as well. And the Greeks, and Heraclitus specifically, believe that human nature is every bit as lawful as the nature we can see outside ourselves. But because we can't see it or smell it or hear it or taste it or touch it, it's even more elusive than the nature around us. Heraclitus says nature loves to hide, and the point that he stresses is how in nature we look around and we don't see the causes of things. We see the consequences of things, which we mistake for being the main point. It's hard, even when you have all this sensory data coming at us, to figure out that what we're seeing is not the organizing principles, but the consequences of those principles. But it's even harder when we can't look inside our head. We can't listen inside our head. We can't smell inside our head. We can't feel inside our head. We do get memories and sensations and more inchoate feelings, but they lack the vividness that the external world has. And so it can lead us into such errors as the modernist error of thinking that, well, if we don't see any constraints, then we must be free inside, right? You know, I don't see a shackle anywhere. I must be free in here. There's nothing visible holding me back. And it leads people to grossly oversimplify their circumstances. The whole development in psychology in the latter half of the 20th century, especially the last quarter of the 20th century, coming to understand the way alcoholism can be transmitted through the generations within a family line, whereas another family line might not have any problem with alcoholism at all. It just, you know, they can drink and they don't feel the need to drink every bottle in the world the way an alcoholic does. And it's the same, not just for that, but we're finding similar patterns for all kinds of behavioral kind of family cultural things that pass down generation after generation. And it is a shock if you're raised from the perspective that we are infinitely free. We have certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? We believe we're born free with no effort on our parts, to discover that instead we're role-playing static roles that have been passed down to us within the dynamics of the psychology of the family.
Well, where's my Brady Bunch? Why aren't I living like the Brady Bunch? I've seen it on TV. That's the ideal life.
Right.
Where's mine?
Why can't we just do it like we see in the TV, where they can make any choice they want to? Why is it we seem to be stuck? How is it, as Freud notes, and so many psychologists and psychiatrists since him, that people think that they're acting and choosing freely exactly when they're carrying out the most stereotypical, caricatured behavior that they themselves can't recognize? You know, you see in this the cryptic workings of some kind of logic that's not visible to the person who's taking the actions. But, you know, with care and diligence, you can sort of tease apart and begin to see that there is a pattern here. So idiocy, right, that the Greeks are concerned about has to do with the ways in which we get trapped in these patterns without realizing that it's happened, so that we are recapitulating the things that feel familiar to us. One's own idiotia, right?
Did you ever see the movie Little Big Man with Dustin Hoffman?
Yes.
You had the contrary Indian who'd so annoyed with life, he's going to do everything in reverse.
Yes.
Well, he to get clean, he throws dirt on himself, and to get dirty, he jumps in the river and he walks backwards everywhere.
That's right. That's right. We get caught up in these frames to our behavior, and more to us, it was a great breakthrough to discover these things, because as moderns, this clashed with our ideology that we're born into. But the ancient Greeks understood this from very early on, that there is lawfulness to our character, that our character acts as a collection of archae within us that act as fountains of order, generating behavior, generating feelings, generating thoughts. What seems, even the most arid, rigorous logician still at some point in his argument resorts to whether or not he is persuaded by the line of argument, right? He might say, well, I see that all of the deductions appear to be valid, but I am still not persuaded. And in that failure to be persuaded, there is the working of his own character, the lawfulness of it, guiding him this way or that.
This is Jung's perspective. I always ignored Jung, but this is what he's trying to tell us.
Yes, yes. And all of this flows from the core observation of Heraclitus, ethos anthropoi daimon, which we translate as character is fate, except that's not really what it means. It's far deeper than that. Right? We've talked about it before. But this is one of those linchpins. And he's not the only one who says that. You find in the Greeks repeatedly references to one's daimon. You find eudaimonia, right, says Aristotle, is the most to be desired. If only you could have a good daimon, a good character that rules you like a god, a daimon, that would nudge you in the right directions so that you lived a healthy life and a fulfilling life, that drove you to do great things. What you don't want is a dysdaimon, which is what the character Desdemona in Shakespeare's Othello is named after, which would be somebody whose daimon is nudging them in the wrong directions towards self-destruction or self-enslavement or other forms of corruption. So this is the core concept here. We aren't actually changing to an entirely different topic by going from part A to part B. We're now shifting from the nature that is around us to the nature that is within us. And what the Greeks believe is that the nature that is within us follows all the same patterns and principles that we've just spent several weeks talking about the nature around us. What is inside of us, our character, is the working of phusis, nature as becoming. And that has ultimate authority, just like nature around us has ultimate authority. You can't argue with gravity. So, in Oedipus, Tyrannus, and in other works, we see the Greeks trying to explicate the hidden lawfulness of character and show us the working of that lawful nature inside of us. And they're doing it to aid us. It is a deliberate project to try to help us to make visible what is hidden from us, right? Phusis cryptus thae philae, says Heraclitus. Nature loves to hide. Well, even more so what's inside of us, right? You couldn't find the limits of the human soul even if you searched for your whole life, says Heraclitus. It is a deep, complicated, difficult subject. So they are trying to help people, including people who are not characterologically predisposed to understand this. In their storytelling, they are trying to help people to see the invisible part inside of themselves, to understand why they do the things they do and what their limits and liabilities are. This is going to be a recurring theme over and over and over in Greek culture and Greek philosophy. And this is what section B is about. So I'm going to call on Phil. You've got your hand up. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, he's going to later on in a couple of paragraphs later, he's going to talk about the influence of culture as sort of influencing our character as well.
Yes.
But I want to say something that's related to that I just wrote this morning to a Democrat who was harassing me. And I want to say that I'm a Democrat, but I'm not saying this to advertise or promote the Democrat, because this is really a criticism. And I said, why is it that the Democrats are so reactionary? But I explained reactionary. I said, I don't mean that you're ultra conservative by the traditional means of what reactionary is. Why is it that Democrats are always reacting afterwards, after what's already been done, right? And in this case, of course, they're outraged by the Supreme Court and overturning Roe versus Wade.
Right.
Something I knew from the beginning, like certainly 6 years ago, I said, just remember the Supreme Court, of course, nobody will listen to me. And I said, I think it's because you guys just simply do not believe that people can be as malfeasant and selfish as they turn out to be. Oh, they're not going to do that. They're not going to cross that line. I mean, that's just indecent. They're not going to do it. We just don't believe it, right? Yeah, they have their gripes and whatever, but this is, and then when they do it, it's like, oh, I'm shocked. Like, what? Why did they do it? This is like, oh, like now, what we're going to do now? Now they're always running behind. You know, I said, why is it that you can't think strategically, sort of like proactive? I mean, like sort of like anticipatory. You should have anticipated this was a possibility. They just do not believe that this is even possible, right? Mm-hmm. Even though it's staring them in the face, they're not going to do that. They're not going to, you know, next the Constitution and, you know, stare decisis and all that, despite of all of this. And I said that this is just not true. If you know within yourself that you yourself is not a pure person, that pure human being, there's good and there's evil within you, then you will know that others are capable of doing that, except maybe even more extreme. You would then understand, yes, they can do this, and they probably will, right? And so therefore you should be ahead of the game, or at least stay even in the game, but rather than always like running like with your heads cut off and just sort of like, oh no, I can't believe they did this. Is outrageous. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that's part of the fact is that you're trapped in a certain ideology that says, no, you know, well, all human beings, they're not going to do that sort of thing. I mean, it's like they will do minor infractions here and there. And it's like, no. As I said in my paintings, you know, we're all fallen angels. Even if we become human beings to begin with, we're not even there. So like once you realize that, then it's like you have to understand that others who are not even fallen angels, they're just part of mankind, is that, oh, there's a good chance they could do it, you know, and therefore you should anticipate that rather than being reactionary. You know, I'm sure they didn't like what I said, but nonetheless, I think that is a case with all sorts of situations. There's a lot more possibilities than you think there is.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, this is one of the things we see not just in what's happening, you know, right now, but generally throughout the modern epoch. We keep seeing the center being blindsided by historical events, as though they keep thinking that the way things are right now is some kind of normative, you know, what's normal. They confuse normal statistically with normative, you know, as in right and stable, as though it is the working out, you know, this is that thing we've talked about where moderns, on the one hand, think that they're objective, but on the other hand, they also normatively believe they're the best and the brightest and the most objective that ever lived. And they think that they are on top because the laws of history and of evolution have put them there. This is a, you know, for example, this is a, shall we say, more socially acceptable version of the 19th century European position, which was that white people were on top, especially white men were on top, because everybody else was a primitive savage version and we were the most evolved, right? You see a lot of this in 19th century literature and politics, just sort of this relentless discussion of eugenics and so forth. And there is a way in which we confuse, and when I talked earlier about a logician being persuaded by inchoate parts of himself that don't have anything to do with noesis, but he thinks he's being strictly intellectual when he concludes that he's not persuaded by a logical argument. It works the other way too. We find ourselves appetized by ideologies that please us. And then we build up, we use our noesis to build up a framework of rationalizations that in hindsight makes it seem as though we reached that conclusion because it was proven to us logically. And we forget what we did in our own mind, which was to take an illogical position that pleased us, a placida, to use Kenneth Smith's term, and then we short it up with rationalizations, and it was never going to stand. This is how moderns treat the status quo. the very word status quo argues that it's a stasis, that it is a state of being that is going to continue. And it has, maybe because it has momentum, maybe because of the laws of history and evolution have made it arrive at the finish line, like you were talking about earlier, Phil, a few sessions ago, the guy who says we're at the end of history. And people keep saying we're at the end of history, by which they mean, I like where we are. And I want it to be proven that this is the period at the end, we're done. Now we're going to stay here forever. And it is never that way. It is never that case. There is a way in which, Hegel's statement, what is familiar to us is for that very reason not recognized for what it is so easy to underestimate the power of. It's one of the major drivers in the way that moderns keep getting blindsided. They are familiar with their circumstances and they come to mistake them for normative. And then as a result, they fail to understand how fragile those circumstances really are. And it makes them, in order to reinforce the belief in the normativity of the status quo, they play foreground background games with what's going on in the world, so that they suppress from their own consciousness all the evidence that's all around them everywhere to be seen that this is unstable. In fact, it's dynamic and it's about to go through a massive change. But the human mind has, to go back to Stephen's initial point, to bring this full circle, a staggering capacity to confuse itself in ways that please itself, the definition of idiocy. To be preoccupied with one's own is to be an idiot in the original definition of the term. And that all the critical emotive content of the word idiot comes from the Greeks' judgment upon what it means to be preoccupied with your own things. If you're preoccupied with your own things, it means you will look away from all the things that aren't yours, that are full of information you should be attending to. And as a result, you get blindsided. All right, so let's dive into the text, because I think we've set the framework well enough here. So he starts out by saying, so the title, Custom and Nature, Aristocracy and Philosophy. So this is a pair, right? Custom and nature goes back to what Donald talked about a few weeks ago when he set up the idea that there are these pairs in the Greeks' understanding of the world. Nature is normative, and then at a human level, in human societies and cultures in our individual lives, we attempt to mimic nature and create something that will harmonize with it. So natural law, the logos, right? We try to imitate that in making our own laws, our nomos. And if we do a good job, the nomos harmonizes with the logos. But if we do a bad job and we disregard the evidence of gnosis and get too obsessed with our own noesis, then we make a nomos that is out of sync with logos. And this creates the catastrophes of history, right? We're pointing everybody in the wrong direction. And it's a catastrophe either way. It's a catastrophe if everybody goes along with those laws and are now pointing against the actual laws of nature. It's equally a catastrophe if you pass a bunch of laws that are out of sync with what people are willing to do, and now they fight you on it. You've got internal struggle in your society. So logos and nomos, right? There is a hint here when he says custom and nature. He's talking about that distinction. What is authoritative? What is kata phusei, according to nature, versus what is merely conventional? What is custom? The nomos. What is it that we have just decided to agree is the truth, whether it is or not? And then he's juxtaposing this against aristocracy and philosophy, right? Aristocracy and philosophy here make another pair. And in this case, it's a different pair. What he's doing with aristocracy and philosophy is saying, and we're gonna see this throughout part B, the Greeks do not have an egalitarian view of human nature. And their original motivation for doing that isn't good, right? They're a conquering people. And so they want to believe the people they've conquered and enslaved are naturally inferior to them. This is, we talked about before, this is where they started as ancients. They started with trying to enforce a set of customs upon themselves and the conquered people that would please them. You do all the work and we'll be philosophizing, soldiers. And thus we'll be able to keep conquering, and we can do that because we're exploiting the labor that you're doing for us, that we're, because we're keeping you trapped. But whenever your custom is out of sync with your nature, over time, you're gonna, if you either crash and burn, or you notice and begin to make changes. And so you get this development of philosophy that says, well, maybe that's how government should work in some benevolent form. But when it doesn't work that way, for example, if you try to enslave an Aristos, the results aren't good. I mean, first of all, you're depriving yourselves of the opportunity to have this Aristos help to govern you. And second of all, you're crushing the spirit of somebody who can't be what you want to try to make him be. And third of all, because you're trying to crush the spirit of somebody who isn't naturally a slave, he's going to fight against you. He may lead a rebellion, right? You may get the Haitian Revolution, and next thing you know, your entire slave society is collapsed around you. Now, we supposedly are freedom loving. So for us, we cheer, yay, overthrow the bad guys. But to the Greeks, who were the slavers, this would have been a catastrophe. So what they wanted to do is reorganize their society in such a way that they would demote the slaves who happened to have lucked out and been in governments. And they wanted to promote the Aristoi, who had had an unlucky life and were among the slaves and should be freed. They developed this philosophy that said that we ought to use our gnosis to pay attention to the difference between the schema for society that we've developed for ourselves and the actual society that we have instead. And when our actual society and our schema are out of sync, we should restructure our society so that it's more just, and therefore harmonizes better with the logos and is therefore more stable. You see what I mean here? There is a process of evolution in the Greek concept of government and society that happens as a result of, not wanting to immediately be overthrown by slave revolts because you've enslaved people who really shouldn't be slaves. Likewise, they had a lot of arguments about the treatment of slaves and what it meant to be a slave. And you can see this in the arguments between Sparta and Athens, for example, where Sparta says that slaves should be absolutely terrified and kept in the most menial condition. You should feel free to kill a bunch of them from time to time just to keep them scared and to keep yourself willing to do that. But the Athenians said, well, this is terrible, right? The fact that some people have more capacity than others doesn't mean that we should exploit them. It means that we should parent them. And a parenting relationship is very different from an exploitative relationship. And so they attempted to restructure their society in such a way that it was very difficult for an outsider to tell who was free and who was a slave, right? Their ideal for Athens, not that they ever achieved it, but their ideal was to get to a point where what it meant to be a slave is that you didn't vote. But otherwise, nobody could tell the difference. You could be a rich slave, you could be a poor slave, you could be an educated slave, you could be an ignorant slave. The whole range of human experience should be open up, as far as the capacity of the human being. And by doing that, their hope was that you could then see the Aristoi bubbling up within the slaves so that they could be promoted and become, part of the government or whatever they could aspire to become. This was the way that that the philosophers who philosophized about the government in Athens thought about it. And the struggle that they had was, of course, they were fighting their own history. And they weren't just fighting their own history, but they were also fighting the momentum of wealth and power of the people who had been Aristoi because they were born into it, not because they deserved to be there. The people who didn't want to rock the boat, who said, I like all this stuff as an ideal because I like it when I praise myself by saying, if I'm in charge, I must be an Aristos. Isn't that great? I'm a philosopher king. I don't like it so much when you actually start investigating me to find out whether I am a philosopher king. And if I'm corrupt and exploitative, now you want to demote me and make me, I don't like that part so much. And so there was this tug of war in Greek society, especially Athens, for were we going to live according to our ideals or were we going to live according to the actual corrupt conditions we happen to have found ourselves in? And so whenever you read the Greeks, you always have to read them with an eye towards there's what they're saying that they want, that they aspire to, and then there's what they're saying as far as their actual current circumstances. And then finally, the third condition, what are their current circumstances that even the people looking are not willing to acknowledge, like, the role of women in Greek society. So aristocracy and philosophy, what Kenneth Smith is doing with this title is he's saying there is this diremption between how human societies organize themselves and how they ought to organize themselves in order to harmonize with nature. And the Greeks were aware of that split, and it concerned them. They recognized that the more disharmony there was between the structure of their society and the actual way that nature works around us and within us, the shorter the lifespan of their civilization would be. And of course, they were endlessly concerned about that because of the Trojan War, right? For us, for at least for US history, I heard someone say, the contrast between the way that the Germans teach their history and the way the Americans teach their history is Americans teach history as a great march of progress from one victory to the next. Hooray, hooray, anthems. And the way the Germans teach their history is a horrific march from one catastrophe to the next. And that's what they teach kids in school. So what did we do wrong? This is how the Greeks were teaching, right? Their own history was the greatest catastrophe they knew in their own history. They did to themselves, and they didn't ever want to do again. So there is this pessimism and this critique, this longing not to fall prey to seductive placida, but to look past it to figure out what does it actually take to not collapse again. So that's what's bound up in this title. I guess I'm going to do in reverse order of who's talked. So I'm going to do Donald first because he hasn't said much yet. Go ahead, Donald.
And we're better off for it.
You always say that.
But somewhere as you're talking, I have this memory that Plato's dialogue, the Charmides, took place on a special day in Athens where the slaves ruled their masters.
Yes.
With some sort of holiday of some kind. I'm not sure of its status.
Saturnalia.
Is it?
The Romans did Saturnalia.
Okay, I'm not.
I don't know what the Greek tradition is, but
this is something I've not thought a lot about, other than it does affect the dialogue.
Yes.
And the progress of it, because I think Socrates makes reference to, because Charmides has a slave boy with him or whatever, and sort of says, well, maybe I should ask him, instead of you, Charmides.
Right. Because this is that day.
Yeah, this is that day when he's in charge. But the other, I think we're very right, especially Stephen, with idiots. But the problem is not the idiot pot maker or the idiot plumber or the idiot stonemason. Those people, it may be even advantageous that they focus intently just on their craft, just on their family and their work. Everyone's heard me talk about philosopher plumbers before, but maybe we don't need them, although I think we would have a better society if we had so many philosophers that they could take up plumbing because they weren't needed for positions of rolling. It's a rule. Idiocy really disqualifies one from guiding the polis, of having that view of what others need,
right,
of what the whole needs,
right,
of how to achieve that. And I think that's enough.
Thank you, Donald. That's good stuff. Yeah, we're gonna come to this over and over. And just a caveat, it's important to say here, it is very hard to talk about the Greek perception of slavery because our own history of slavery in the United States in particular is so wretched and horrific. It is, and the way that we explain it is that, oh, we just did what everybody else did, and slavery has always been bad, and ergo, let's not do this thing that everybody has always done. What we don't want to do is say, maybe in the history of the world, nobody was ever as industrially exploitative of their slaves as we were. We turned it into a science, into an industry of how to maximize the extraction of value from other human beings and minimize the quality of life that we gave them in order to, create a nice big profit. And maybe that way of seeing the world, people as mere numbers, is not the normal way that slavery happens, but is a truly bizarre aberration that fits the rest of the way we see the world. That even when we banish slavery, most businesses still treat their workers as numbers. They're not people, they're human resources. They go into a spreadsheet. How many hours did they work? How much do we have to pay them? What's the cost of their benefits? How does that tally up against our profits? This reduction of people to numbers, it is in common between these two modes of existence. And we're not really well equipped to see that because of how we feel about ourselves as moderns. We think we're the best. And we're doing a great march of progress. We couldn't possibly be mired in the same kinds of thinking. And so as a result, it's very hard to talk about how the Greeks or the Romans saw slaves, because we assume they saw slaves the way we see slaves, that they treated slaves the way we treat slaves. And what we're not really prepared to do is understand the wild diversity of forms of slavery that have existed, not just among the ancients, but around the world over time, such that it's really kind of weird that we call them all the same thing. It is actually quite strange that we call them the same thing, because they're so radically different from each other. There have been times, when in cultures whose treatment of the slaves, whatever they called them, whatever their actual word was for that class, was so egregious that it makes us start to compare it, to Haiti or the Old South. But there are plenty of places and times where that's not the case at all. And the use of the word slave obscures more than it reveals, because we can't see past this huge potent thing that we did and the way that we did it. So forms of slavery, some cultures had forms of slavery in which the slave was somebody you adopted into your family, like your children. When they came of age, they were free and married off, and that was slavery. And you're like, that's slavery? It's like, well, this is how we translate the word. Whatever the word was they used, we've translated it to the word slave. And so now we've got this equated with, whipping the crap out of people and treating them like commodities. When we look at the Greeks, what we're going to find is this enormous diversity. I pick on Athens and Sparta just because they're two extreme poles, but there was an enormous diversity for what these words meant and how people treated each other. And because of all this, and because of the way that the terminology of equality has been used in order to put distance between ourselves and our own period of industrial slavery, it's difficult for us to understand that the Greeks could look at human beings as not being equal, and yet not necessarily see that as cause for maximizing the exploitation of the people that you thought you could get away with exploiting. Whether the Greeks believed that depended on which city-state and which time. Stephen, you're next, and then Phil.
I went along to see the film The Northmen.
How'd you like that?
Well, I thought I was going to watch a piece of rubbish. I thought, I'm going to be disappointed by this. I hate films about over-the-top Vikings because it's nonsense.
Right.
I saw a film about over-the-top Vikings, but after that, it was pretty good. I was quite surprised at how clever. The film is entertaining. It's full of over-the-top Vikings, beautifully done. But it's very, very, very clever. It's an adaptation of the Hamlet story, which isn't that close to the original, of course. But
right.
It's full of irony.
Yeah.
Hamlet, his father's murdered. His uncle takes over the kingdom, but in this one, Hamlet heads off to Russia. And there he's lamenting over the injustice done to him while he's working for other Vikings collecting slaves.
Yes.
And then when he hears some of the slaves are destined to go back to his uncle's kingdom, he conspires to hide himself among the slaves and live the life of a slave, to go back to get his justice, his revenge. So as fantasy driven as a novel, as a movie is, it's very strongly that throughout the film, it's the question, for example, is how much the Vikings used slaves. That was it, human wealth. But
Right.
yeah, I was shocked. The film, it's really well worth seeing for the degree of irony that's in it.
Thank you for that, Stephen. I'm looking forward to seeing it. The historical period I study the most is the Viking Age. So I'm very interested in this film. I'm glad to hear a good review of it. Yeah, you see, I mean, there were slaves in the medieval period, right? We talk about lords and serfs and warriors and clergy, but there were also slaves. We just don't talk about them as much. And the slaves that were held, by medieval cultures, the justification for holding them was that this was the way God wanted it. This was God's plan. There's only one God. He designed everything. He's the source of all meaning. Therefore, if you're a slave, God must want you to be a slave. So be the best slave you can, or you'll go to hell, right? This is the framework of a medieval form of slavery. And that's very different from a ancient conception of slavery, where they believed that the gods were subordinate to nature. That was your human character that determined what you were. And that therefore, whether you should try to be a good slave or whether you should try to overthrow the slaveholders depended upon whether it was just that you were a slave and that you were being treated justly as a slave. It depended on how well the society was harmonizing with nature. If they had enslaved an Aristos, they deserved to have a slave rebellion because they were screwing it up, right? They were trying to enslave someone who it's not in their nature to be a slave. But the same is true if they tried to enslave a doulos or a banalsos and then treat them badly, because all human beings, naturally need and want certain quality of life. And if the slave owners are being too exploitative, they should expect that there's going to be pushback, that it's going to collapse. We'll come back to this, but Phil, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, thank you for explaining the Greeks a little deeper than I understood it, but nonetheless, I want to say something. First of all, I want to apologize for the fact that indeed the American treating of the slaves were exceptionally bad.
We were horrible.
So I want to acknowledge that. But I also want to say that there is another case that is almost as bad, maybe even worse in some sense, because it's generational, and that's the Vedic religions. The caste system essentially is industrial, and it's generational. Well, it's millennial. Let's put it that way. It's even more in some sense, because the great tragedy of our slavery system was that, like the innocent kid who was born, he didn't offend anybody, he's a slave. I think that's just unjust. I could see how if somebody wronged you and you conquer them, maybe they deserve it, maybe not, but I could see at least some justification. But somebody who had nothing to do with anything, that is unjust. And so the Vedic religion certainly had that. In fact, when I was studying the Bhagavad Gita, that was exactly the point that I sort of walked out, because when Krishna told Arjuna, just do your duty and kill all your relatives because and you don't even understand the system. And I say, I think that Krishna should have learned something for Arjuna and say, human beings actually are developing in conscience. Maybe we shouldn't do that. So maybe I don't have a deeper understanding of the Bhagavad Gita. But that's when I say, oh, you're saying all this in a sense to justify the caste system,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
So
that's right.
I want to say that. Now, in terms of this sort of Aristoi, I'm a little ambivalent about that because on the one hand, I certainly accept that certain people have different qualities of competence. I accept that. But I think in spite of that, you have to have at least a degree of compassion for others who might have less so in order to have a reasonable society. I do not even mean necessarily that everybody has to have the same thing, but it's like, something reasonable. And I think that's why I equivocate on that, because on the one hand, I want to recognize that it's true, but on the other hand, I also want to recognize there's other qualities that are just as important.
Right.
And if you don't have that, it just seems to me you exploit your propensity to exploit the system, even though you might not intend to, it ends up being so. And the thought, about why human beings have this sort of like idiocy, when we talked about it, it just occurred to me, whether that is like God who created us to be imperfect, or whether nature, in some sense, have not allowed us or to perfect ourselves to the point that we actually have absolute control. I could just imagine what it would be if we did not have some idiocy, that in some sense we will become the supreme rulers of the universe. And I wonder what that would be. I wonder what that would be like, because we would be, quote, righteous in whatever we do. And I just do not believe that's true. I mean, so I think maybe that is just the way to have some breathing room for all those that would be exploited, and we've done quite a bit of it. And I don't mean that like downcast, the agricultural system and all that, because, we have to do what we have to do. But I can imagine that, if, let's say, the 10% of the mammals in this world was themselves also become domesticated, what kind of world we would have. So I have some hesitations. That's one of the reasons why I myself, and I'm speaking only for myself, always shied away from acknowledging myself as an Aristoi, because I do not want the power to contribute to that problem, right? I just want the power to do what I'm going to do the best I could do it without exerting it onto others, except when they want to listen to what I got to say. And that's all I want to do, because I want to remain at least somewhat hands-off in terms of what I might exert on the world, at least I could have my hands as clean as possible, when I meet my end. I don't want to say I meet my maker, but meet my end. And I know that it will not be perfectly clean, but it will be the best I could do. So I think that's the problem that people have, is they do not have enough, what I would call humanity, even if it be fallen. So that's my point of view. And some people would say, well, in fact, Stephen has said it, go on dreaming your dreams. And maybe I'll continue to do so.
Thanks, Phil. Okay, so let's Donald makes the comment there in the chat for those who haven't seen it. Aristotle's defense of slavery in his Nicomachean Ethics reveals the injustice of modern slavery, because the kind of slavery that Aristotle's defending doesn't look anything like what we do in the modern world when we enslave people. It's an entirely different schema. And I want to make sure, I'm going to go back to the text in a second. Really, this is all coming off the title, Custom and Nature, Aristocracy and Philosophy. We're going to talk about why the Greeks believed people are not created equal and that society should include hierarchies. And we're going to talk about that in a couple of ways. We're going to talk about what is it that they're seeing in human nature that is worthy and that we should learn from, versus what are they reading into human nature that's self-serving, that protects their own status quo, even if it's unjust and not worthy. And what we're going to find is it's going to be a mix of the two. And that sometimes the Greeks critique themselves on this very subject. When is it wishful thinking? That somebody doesn't have the capabilities you do. But you can see it if you read Nicomachean Ethics and you read the section on slavery, how striking the contrast is between what he's defending and what we did in the modern world, which was nothing like that. So again, this is another place where what is a recurring theme with Kenneth Smith? All the important words mean the wrong thing to us. Half the reason that we're trapped inside the modernist worldview is that all of the important words have definitions that presuppose the modernist worldview. It's just almost impossible unless you turn and wrestle with the language itself. It's almost impossible to have a clear conversation that would allow us to see from the ancient perspective or from the medieval perspective, or even to describe them. And slave and slavery that's some of that language that is incredibly locked in to the modernist worldview. But let's dive into the text. Before they get into anything like government or slavery or so on, Kenneth's going to talk here about the core issue, the more fundamental issues. And he's going to say, he starts out by saying, the Greeks realized that all peoples are liable to delude themselves into ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism. I learned that in 9th grade anthropology class. That's one of my favorite words, ethnocentrism. Imagining their own invented and customary ways are the very ways of the world. That is, they are confusing the nomos and the logos. They're confusing the habits of society with the laws of nature. And you see that, when Phil asks, how is it that the US Democratic Party keeps being blindsided? It's because they are confusing their own habits and customs with the very laws of the world. They think that the status quo represents the judgment of nature, and they don't understand that it's an entirely different realm of normativity. It doesn't carry that kind of authority that they imbue it with. A couple of weeks ago, I used the phrase appropriating the authority of nature. Appropriating the authority of nature. In section A, when Kenneth talks about Canute whipping the waves because the tide's going the wrong way and he can't launch his ships, and of course what historians say now is he was doing it to demonstrate to the nobility that it didn't do any good. You can't command nature, you have to harmonize with it. But that idea of the Egyptian pharaoh who recarved the face of the Sphinx to put his own face on there, appropriating the authority of nature, right? This is what it's not just egomaniacs who grandiosely do it in front of us in ways we can recognize. What he's saying here is, it is the normal habit of all human beings to imagine that their own customs somehow represent the laws of nature in action. A failure to see the artifice, the arbitrariness, and thus the fragility and the lack of normativity of the ways that we live our lives. Let me see if I can drop all this text into the chat here for those who, yeah, there it is. So our initial topic is not about governments per se, but about the general problem of how we live and what we think is authoritative and what we think isn't. He says, human beings grow ensnared in their own idiosyncrasies and prejudices, their prejudgments, in the order of what is their own, idiomata, right? Idiotia, you can smell it. We're in the vicinity of the origins of the term idiot. They grow ensnared in the order of what is their own. They sink into a way of thinking that is circularly conditioned by what they have already taken for granted, as if this were a rigorously rational argument or stringently demonstrated evidence. And part of the way in which we confuse the things we've taken for granted for rigorous rational arguments is that we use camouflage to disguise it from ourselves that that's what we did, and to disguise it from others. This is what the process of rationalization consists of. We take something that was just the way that we happen to already think or prefer things, and then we shore it up with a bunch of stuff that sounds like logic and science, but it never was the reason why we believed it in the first place, and the whole thing wouldn't hold together. The reason we believed it in the first place is because we believed it in the first place. we find ourselves in the middle, right? Like a tragic hero in media res, we're in the middle of our story. We already believe a whole bunch of things before we even start philosophizing or trying to engage in logic. And then once we think that it's important to be logical, we hear Socrates' dictum, the unexamined life is not worth living for a man. And we think, well, I don't want to live an unexamined life. I want to be logical. I want to be philosophical. So then we run around and take all of our illogical prejudices and shore them up with a bunch of stuff to camouflage them and make them seem like the products of logic. And so if anyone questions us on them, we'll deploy our rationalizations to distract them from the fact that this is a completely irrational, illogical belief that we have that actually has no real justification, just a bunch of excuses that we've made up later. This is what he's talking about here, the circular conditioning. And anytime he talks about what we've taken for granted, you know he's quoting Hegel here. The familiar, what is familiar to us, because of that very reason, is not recognized for what it is. That's what we're doing when we take for granted what we have already taken for granted, when we mistake it as having an authority it doesn't have. And it gets even worse once our brain starts camouflaging it so that it starts looking like it was the result of a rational argument. I was reading a story about a guy who was a French expert on serial killers, self-proclaimed. He was a real self-promoter, and he was known by law enforcement. You know, he interviewed serial killers in jail and blah, blah, blah. And it took people over a decade to figure out that the whole thing was a fabric of fictions. He wanted to be an expert on serial killers. So he began inventing a past for himself in which he had interviewed all these people. And because he invented the past, he fooled people in the present, and they began to give him the very access that he claimed to have had. And with that access, interviewing serial killers on the basis of past serial killers he claimed to have interviewed but never had, he began to learn about serial killers and become an expert. So he was self-created himself out of a fiction. You see what I'm saying? And this group of people who used to be enthusiastic about him eventually went back and critiqued his own biography of himself and showed how it was not just a tissue of lies, but a massive labyrinth of lies. Everywhere you turned, everything was based on some other falsehood that also wasn't true. It was in the New Yorker, if you want to look for the article. I think it's in the current issue. It's really fascinating because it goes into such detail about a case study of one human being in a dramatic fashion doing what all of us do all the time when we circularly condition ourselves to believe that what we believed when we started thinking was somehow something that we concluded as the result of rigorous philosophizing, when in fact it was just some assumption or prejudice or what have you. The inability to tell the two apart, to the Greeks, was the most alarming possible thing. If you can't tell truth from fiction, if you can't tell the authority of nature from, I just said this thing and I have a club and I'm going to hit you on the head and make you agree to it, if you can't tell those two things apart, you have no chance. Your society is going to fall apart. Your life is going to fall apart. You're not in harmony with nature and its laws, so you're going to get in trouble everywhere you turn. This was what they were terrified of. This is what they thought had happened with the Greeks and the Trojan War, and they didn't ever want that to happen again. Sharon, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Oh, he went away. Okay, so I just have a quick question.
Please.
The very last sentence here that says, this idiotism is human nature, a primal psychology. the reason humans are cultural creatures who are captives of their own customs and words the world over.
Yes.
But primal psychology really sticks out to me because I think in modern terms, I think I don't think there's any other species that has the capacity for cognitive dissonance that we have.
Yeah.
All right. And where moderns are at significant risk today is the amount of disinformation that's flooding the airways with our capacity for cognitive dissonance puts us in very serious societal jeopardy.
It does. It does. Yeah, let's talk about that. So this is what the Greeks were most afraid of, right? This is what he's saying in this very opening sentence. They got this sense that, I mean, when they studied their own history and the ways it went so tragically wrong, they couldn't help but conclude that what the archaic Greeks thought they were doing and what they were actually doing was worlds apart. And furthermore, there was evidence all around them that in hindsight, you could see just a rich tapestry of evidence saying, don't go this way. And yet they were able to disregard all that evidence and go that way anyway to their own disaster. And so this, heightened the Greeks' concern about, well, God, we can't let that happen to us again. How do we possibly keep that from happening? And so they began to really study this question of was it just us? Do other people not have this problem? Is it a specifically Greek problem? And when you read the Greeks, and especially Herodotus, but also Thucydides and other writers, you'll find that where medieval Christians tended to, medieval Europeans, where medieval Europeans tended to write about other cultures as all being ungodly, inferior to their own, needing to be, converted or exterminated. The way the Greeks wrote about other cultures was with a great deal of interest. And part of what they were trying to do is find out, are we the only ones who have this horrible problem? Or is this something we all have? And what they found is no matter where they looked, everybody is liable to the same problem. Every culture has this same tendency to confuse its own customary ways with the very laws of nature. And from this, they concluded that it must be part of the shared character that all human beings have, regardless of their culture, that we're liable to this preoccupation with one's own things, idiotia, right? One's own, that it is hypnotic for us in a way that's very analogous to the way a human face is hypnotic to a little baby. They've run experiments. If you hold up anything that looks vaguely like a human face, the baby will look at it. And they can't help it. They just orient towards it. And later in life, once we get past the point where as an infant, we desperately need to orient towards our parents, we still can't stop doing it, right? Pareidolia is a thing. You look out into the world and there's a rock outcropping and you go, that looks like a face. Because it's built into our character. We can't stop seeing faces everywhere. I don't know if you remember a few decades ago, they took the photos of Mars and there was a hill that just happened to have shadows cast on it. And we're like, oh my God, it's a face on Mars. There's Martians. They carved a face. We literally could not imagine that we could be wrong. All over all kinds of tabloids and magazines, everybody's speculating, look, it's the Martians. They put a face. But from another angle with the light coming in differently, it was obviously not a face. It was just a natural rock. Just like all the rocks here on Earth that we're constantly confusing with a human face. That's how strongly our nature conditions us to look for faces. And what he's saying here is that's how this thing about us as human beings being enwrapped with a culture and thinking that it is the whole world is as strong in us as our orientation toward faces. Even when we know that it's a liability of our character, we still can't stop doing it. You have to stay right on top of it every moment of the day to keep interrupting yourself in the process of falling for your culture and thinking that it's the whole world and that it's real. And, this partially goes back to what's the question that Stephen raised, although it's not going to answer it. We're going to come back to this over and over. Stephen put his finger on exactly the right thing. how can this be evolutionarily adaptive when it leads to so much, as you pointed out, Sharon, so much danger, right? The capacity for misinformation turns into a kind of pseudophilia, in that we are just addicted to happy lies that please us. We just, even when we know that even people who will tell you that politicians can't be trusted and that politics is a realm of lying and blah, 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 they still fall for the very next lie that comes from their own political party. They can't stop themselves from participating in the acculturation. So the question that Stephen raises and that you're raising again, Sharon, it comes down to this. There must be something incredibly adaptive about this magnetic attachment we have to culture. And this is part of my meta argument that I add on top of Kenneth Smith, but I think it's compatible with what he says, which is that culture is Homo sapiens' stupid pet trick. We can't run fast like a cheetah. We can't fly the way the birds can. We can't do all these other things, but culture is the thing that we can do. And what that makes possible is an extreme level of diversity compared to any other species. As you say, Sharon, you look around all the other species, none of them seems as capable of becoming self-conflicted and self-deluded as we are. And I think that that is an inevitable consequence of the more general adaptive trait that we have, which is that we have a broader range of freedom of action than other organisms, because we got evacuated through evolution of a whole bunch of our suite of instincts. And in return, we were given this craving, this need for culture. So instead of having a biologically locked in set of behaviors, we have this biological drive to adopt a set of behaviors. But we don't seem to care too much what they are. Whatever we're exposed to at the right age, we want to become that. We want to fill in the empty frame inside of us. We desperately want to fill it in with what the culture is doing around us, because without that, we're not complete and we can't function in the world, right? The list of instincts that we have compared to any other mammal is just grossly inadequate. But if you supplement that with the guidance, with the nomos of a culture and its customs, you end up with a complete behavioral repertoire, and we're able to be a whole person in the world. And that aching need to not be empty and to fill it up and to become a whole who can act is one of the instincts that evolution did give us to drive us to mold ourselves into a culture. Now, the adaptive advantages of molding yourself into a culture are obvious. One of them is it's no longer you against the world. You've got a team, right? And so you don't, there's a whole bunch of people solving problems around you and helping each other, so that it's your chances of evolutionary success go much higher, much higher. You see this with the eusocial instincts, like eusocial insects, honeybees, bumblebees, ants. They too are driven to fit themselves into the larger group. There's a meme going around Facebook now, a biologist put out. Most people have never seen this before, which is that honeybees go through stages of development after their metamorphosis, after they emerge as a bee. Day by day, week by week, they are drawn to different behaviors. Is their job just to clean their own cell? Is their job to clean the cells nearby? Is their job to find pupae that, or larvae that haven't hatched and make them warm? That they go through this like the stages of a child, who takes different interests at different stages. Honeybees take different interests, and it's not until the last few weeks of their life that they take an interest in leaving the hive and going to collect honey and pollen. But they've been bees for quite a while at that point. They just started with something simple, like, you start with your own cell and you work your way out, and your behavior gets richer and richer until you're finally prepared to go out into the world. This is bee culture. But that bee culture is built by instincts. But you can see human beings doing the same thing, right? They also will go through stages of development and take interest in different things, but it's not biologically driven by instincts in the same way. We have stages, but exactly what goes into each stage depends upon the culture that you're in order to fill us in and be complete. So this is the thing. In order to do that, you have to have a kind of monomania for the painting that you're making inside your frame of your own behavior, right? What it is that you're taking in and the creation of yourself has to be all encompassing, or you'll be distracted, right? The world's a busy place, right? If you didn't have a drive to paint in that frame, you might go out into the world a really incomplete person and, fall prey to be run over by cars. Who knows what would happen to you? Forget to eat. I forget to eat often. It's like, it would evolutionarily, for this strategy to work for us as a species, we have to really be preoccupied with our own things. We have to be idiots, basically. That's what makes this work. It's just that, it's a two-edged sword. Everything that comes with good things comes with bad things too. And the liabilities of being an idiot, you were saying earlier, I think, was it, I can't remember if it was Phil or Donald. Maybe it was Donald. It was Donald talking about, if someone's an idiot and they're a pot maker, there are limits to the damage that they can do. You can still be a really good pot maker and be an idiot, but you really don't want them in the government. If you're an idiot and you're now in charge of how we're going to spend all of the tax money, it's going to be a disaster. You're going to be lining your pockets and giving it to your allies, or you could be the other kind of idiot. You have some intellectual scheme. I know we're all going to go to the moon. Not just some of us, all of us are going to go to the moon. I'm going to stop spending money on roads and water and food. We're going to put all the money into rockets, and then we're surprised when there's a famine in winter, right? I mean, we can be both kinds of idiot. We can be possessed by crazy ideas. We could be possessed by our emotions and our feelings and experiences. So, all right, we'll come back to this, but Phil, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, before I get to my point, I want to just say in passing, I like the way you said B culture. Is that BE culture or BEE culture? Yes. Thank you for the double talk. But I want to, in a sense, say something slightly different from that, and that is which came first, the chicken or the egg? I had this in this meeting with a guy who's a dedicated Marxist, but a kind of neo-Marxist. And we were talking about the criticism of Marx, that it didn't go far enough because it left out many dimensions, only dealt with the economy. And I agree with him that his criticism of traditional capitalism was correct insofar as it went. And then later on, I said, there does seem to be a problem, because for any ideas to be correct is not good enough. It has to be manifest in the world, right? And unfortunately, the only two major cultures that have manifested have turned out to be wrong. That is the Soviet Union, which completely did not manifest Marxism. It became a dictatorial imperial system. Mm-hmm. Or China, right? And so it's hard to live with the virtue of the theory when those who export it and manifest it turn it into a complete bastardization of what it is. So you can't, you say, well, how many chances are you going to get before you get it right? I mean, like, there is a problem. And I said, like, maybe there's something deeper than even culture, in this case, a certain theory. Like, why is it that throughout civilization, most of the major civilization, maybe there's some minor ones that we've forgotten about, has been so addicted to power. There seems to me there would be much more diversity, even into the multiplicity. There's some, great culture would emerge. It's not about conquest and power. And I wonder whether that's not even more fundamental than culture itself, although I admit that the culture is an important part. Because why does every culture, in a sense, subjugate others, subjugate women? I mean, all sorts of things. It seems to me there seems to be a destiny to the manifestation of power as the ultimate, I hate to call it virtue, the ultimate driver, the ultimate virtue of humanity. And so I so which came first, the chicken or the egg, And I like what Heidegger said, even though I acknowledge Heidegger became a Nazi and was a Nazi. But I think what he said was nice, because I came to mind when you talk about this whirlpool, and he talked about that. And in fact, in some ways, he went back even further than the ancient Greeks, although he certainly focused on Heraclitus a lot.
Yeah.
That all of us are born thrown into this whirling mess. And it doesn't make sense to begin with. Everything just whirling around. And then we slowly, as we whirl around, we begin to pick up different parts. And after a while, we have some structure that has to do with us and our understanding. And you begin to form what's called hermeneutic circle,
right? A
hermeneutic whirlpool, right? And that's kind of important because that's partly gathered from culture or your direct experience with nature or whatever it is. And you begin to string together some sense, like a spider, a web of understanding. But within that whirlpool, there has to be a degree of, how should I say, analysis or criticism that, certain parts of it may be false, you eliminate. Because if you do not have an ability to eliminate from the whirlpool of things, then in a sense, you become trapped in the whirlpool itself, right? So that, I think that's a criticism I have maybe with culture altogether, is that once you just sort of accept it, then in a sense, it has you, even if it's wrong. Yeah. I mean, there it is. It is the way it is. And although you're tied to it, you have to be able to be critical enough to say, no, this part is not correct. At least I will not adopt this part. This part is really incorrect, and I'll try to add my voice to the incorrectness. I mean, I think that's how the intellect comes into the whirlpool. Because if you don't have that sense of criticism of yourself, of the culture you're trapped into, then in a sense, you're forever just trapped into a system that's given to you. And I think that's an important part. I think he extended Hegel because Hegel sort of accept, the culture and then sort of like purify in terms of itself. And he said, no, we're thrown into this state of confusion and we have to elevate ourselves out of it and in some sense know what to accept and not to accept. And I think when I begin to read this text, I somehow wonder whether there's enough self-criticism, even the Greeks had, to it, because so many things is, it just seems so correct. It must be correct.
Yeah.
Did they go out and actually see? No, that actually is not correct. I mean, there has to be a feedback that's outside of the system itself. So I think that there is some criticism and the limitation of the Greeks is as much as I admire them.
Yeah. They're not to be idolized. They're to be studied.
Mhm.
You know, there's things that they got right and there's things that they got wrong, and we can learn a lot from both of them. So I'm going to dive in a little here. One thing I'm going to say about this is I don't know if you guys, you know, how much you guys like Greek mythology. When I was a kid, I was always reading every book I could find in the school library on Greek mythology, and then the public library. Whatever other books on mythology you've read, you should read Robert Graves' The Greek Myths. It's a fat collection. It has, and part of what makes it go is he, instead of doing like Bullfinch and Hamilton, who are kind of the two most famous who've written about the Greek myths, instead of focusing on the narrative storytelling, he tells stripped down versions of the stories with an enormous number of footnotes at the end of each, or endnotes at the end of each little short section. And in the endnotes, he tells you about alternate versions of the myths that don't harmonize very well with the versions that were taught in school, to show that these myths took different forms in different places. And he's constantly, the other thing he does is he's constantly tying them back to strange rituals and ceremonies and festivals that the Greeks had at the local level, where every village had its own enormous constellation of seasonal and other kinds of rituals that they did. It's like, oh, it is the, you know, fourth day of whatever. It's time we all go down to the well and, you know, make a little teddy bear out of clay and throw it in the well. And that's what we've been doing for centuries. And why have we been doing it? Well, let me tell you this myth. You know, this was part of Robert Graves' line, is that there was this relationship between the myths as having an explanatory function that went with all of these strange little local cultural things that people were doing all the time, that they themselves, you know, thought that they knew why they were doing it, but then maybe they didn't. And especially if you're familiar with the Greek myths and you think you know the story of Prometheus or Perseus or what have you, that's what makes Robert Graves' book even better. Because yeah, you'll see the familiar version, although it'll be a little odd the way he tells it, but then there's all these footnotes and he says, well, unless Perseus's dad was this, in this version he had a different dad. In this version his mother was actually this other person. In this version these two people are brother and sister instead of married. And it's like, it's this constant, it's this weird maelstrom of alternate realities, if you will, and you know, all being tied back to these local cult customs and traditions. It's fascinating, and the Greeks wondered about it. They wrote a lot about, you know, trying to figure out why do we have all these different versions? Why all these different variants? So we'll come back again and again to this question of culture and the role that it plays in us. But let's go back to the text for a moment. So he says, and again, he's describing the ancient view. This is part of, if we want to learn to put on and take off the ancient view, that is to be able to take off and put back on the modern view, we have to sort of grok that this is how they see things. Most humans, as a consequence of what they take for granted and what they believe can be safely ignored or neglected, right? I talk a lot about foreground, background. This is what he's talking about here. As a consequence of that, they inhabit envelopes of, on the one hand, cultural consensus, and on the other hand, private fantasies and preferences, as if these constituted truth itself, right? Everybody says is one of the realms of truth. And most people are possessed by everybody says. But we all know weirdos with their strange ideas who don't fit into the crowd very well. But they too, although they think of themselves as freed from the crowd, they are also possessed by their private fantasies and preferences. They have just changed allegiance in respect to whatever the topic is that we're talking about. But this same thing, inhabiting them as if these constituted truth itself. So last chapter, section A, or the last section of chapter 4, we talked about the Greeks seeing the realm of nature as the source of what is valid, right? We said intrinsically valid, he auto katafuse. If something is this way in nature, it is thereby justified. And we know that it's true. We know that it's valid just because it actually occurs in nature. Now, when we say that the Greeks saw things that way, we're obviously not talking about most Greeks, or at least we're not talking about the Greeks most of the time. Some of the Greeks, in their most philosophical moments, could see that they and everybody else around them were, instead of that, doing this, inhabiting private fantasies and preferences and cultural consensus, as if they constituted the truth and not nature constituting the truth. The confusion of the two realms was widespread in the ancient world. And ancient philosophers were concerned about that. They saw it as a danger, a great hazard for both for civilization and for individual lives. Heraclitus writes about this a lot. He describes most people as sleepwalkers. He says they are as heedless of what goes on around them when awake as they are when asleep. And they turn away to private intelligences of their own little dreams. And they walk through the world physically while mentally instead occupying this dreamscape that's playing out inside of them, detached from reality or only connected in certain places in warped ways. And he said that's what's normal for people. And it's something we have to try to get out of. We talked last chapter about the ethos of agon, struggling against what comes naturally to you. And so Heraclitus argues there, and the Greeks more widely, the philosophical Greeks more widely, that this idiotism that is in us is something we have to struggle against. Because even the best of us are normally in the state of idiotism. Even while we're philosophizing, even while I'm explaining this to you, an enormous amount of what I'm doing is sleepwalking. I'm sleepwalking a dream in which I'm trying to philosophize and participate in a discussion. And it's just moments and glimmers of greater consciousness mixed in with the stew of sleepwalking, of inhabiting the fantasy of engaging in philosophy, and doing so in a culturally consensual context, right? Like this Zoom call. There isn't, this is one of the things that towards the late stages of ancient Greek philosophy, when it was starting to all fall apart, the philosophers, the owl of Minerva only takes flight with the fall of night. The philosophers were beginning to critique themselves and their society and go, wow, we just did not live up to what we were hoping we would live up to. Things are kind of a mess. And that's the stage at which they start to be critical enough to say maybe the entire idea of a rigid caste system is fundamentally broken, because we find among our rulers lots of oligarchs who are not Aristoi, even though all this time they were claiming that they were Aristoi, and we believed that they were Aristoi, and they aped the outward forms of what we imagined Aristoi should look like. It turned out we were mistaken, and we were being ruled by Douloi and Banausoi. Oh God. And this is also the stage, Stoicism, the spread of Stoicism throughout the Roman Empire corresponds to with some of this critique, where they begin to say, you can find some of the greatest, most compassionate human beings not among the ruling class, but among the slaves. In exact contradiction to the promise of the ancient world, they find themselves topsy-turvy, like one of those films where when someone you suddenly realize that the protagonist has been deluded, and the camera suddenly starts tilting and swooping around as though the world has become unmoored. And this is the environment in which the Stoics are saying, you know what? Why don't we just try not to be dicks, regardless of our caste, regardless of our wealth, no matter how popular we are? Maybe we should really be focusing on, can we even get the fundamentals right and not just be horrible people? So yes, as Stephen says, the knight that makes it to the Holy Grail was the biggest idiot in Camelot, Sir Percival, the peasant knight. So they basically, after a great deal of work, the ancients came around to the position of the earlier lyrical poets, which was the three terrible, terrible burdens we bear for being mortals. Yes, we die, and that sucks. And yes, our creative works don't last either, and that sucks. But worst of all is that we're so goddamn stupid. It's like, why nature did you make us so stupid? To go right back to what Stephen said at the very beginning of this, how is this the plan that we are suffering this benightedness? And yet we are conscious enough that the best of us notice that it's happening. We talked last time about Socrates, and Socrates trying to work out why would the oracle at Delphi say the wisest of men. Then there is no one wiser than Socrates, says the oracle, which at first sounds like he's saying that Socrates is the wisest, but Socrates works it over. Sorry, it first sounds like the oracle is saying Socrates is the wisest, but he works it over and works it over and works it over, and he realizes that typically, right, the Python is being cryptic, and that she didn't say he was wise. She just said there wasn't anyone wiser than he was. And he's like, I get it now. Homo sapiens, we're all fools. And I know I'm a fool. And that makes me wiser than most of the rest of the fools around me who think that they're wise. And that's the pinnacle of my wisdom, is to know that I know nothing. There is a, he's writing as Athens and Sparta are tearing themselves apart in exactly the way that, of all things, they never ever wanted to do. They are on the downslope. They feel like they're on the downslope. They have an additional level, additional capacity for self-criticism imposed upon them by the failing circumstances of their society. And people who aren't paying attention wouldn't even suspect that they're failing. I mean, they're building the greatest temples and monuments they ever had right now. They have the biggest armies. They're known more widely in the world than ever before, and they know more of the world than they ever knew before. You can just go through the checkbox of did we win criteria, and they look like they're winning, except, as the more perspicacious among them are noticing, they're doing the one thing that they swore they would never ever do because it would lead to their downfall. So that's helping them to have a level of distance from their own ethnocentrism that normally we don't get. And this is why Hegel says it is late in the stages of a society, when it's beginning to unravel, that people are willing to question the immersion, that driving addictive immersion in their own culture and mistaking it for reality. More of them are starting to be dislodged from that because it's just not working. There's too much cognitive dissonance between what their private fantasies and cultural consensus tell them ought to be happening and what's actually happening. And every time they're jarred loose from that comfortable sleepwalk, just for a moment they blink and they go, sweet Jesus, what is this I'm looking at for a moment? And most of us then close our eyes and say, there, I solved the problem, it went away. But every so often we take away what we saw and go, well, crap, I guess the world is different than we thought it was. And we begin to be capable of philosophizing. So this is one of the themes he's talking about in this chapter. He says, this idiotism, this is what Sharon quoted before, this idiotism is human nature. Now, he doesn't mean it's the sum total of human nature, but it is in our ethos anthropoi daimon, right? That capacity of the Greek language to simultaneously speak at multiple levels. A character is a man's fate, but it is also a culture's fate and a people's fate and the fate of a species, because the character is the natural lawfulness at work within them, the logos inside of us working itself out. And so this craving for one's own culture, to feel like one is a part of something, this is core. It is right in the bedrock of human nature. He calls it a primal psychology, and this reference to a primal psychology goes hand in hand with his earlier references to gnosis and noesis as being part of there being two core faculties of the baseline metabolism of the mind. That turn of phrase is very close to primal psychology, right? And not by accident. This merging with the culture, this forming a whole between ourselves, the individual, and the larger culture that we meld into, this is gnosis at work. Noesis can't form wholes. That's what gnosis does. Gnosis uses the richness of our senses and our feelings and our memories to weave us into the larger tapestry of what's going on in the world around us. This is one of the ways in which the idiotism, one of the expressions of the idiotism, you can see how it could be adaptive. Because if you could be drawn out of your head and into what you see and smell, you might notice the tiger approaching. You might see the ripe fruit high in the tree, right? You are drawn to weave yourself into the larger picture. It only becomes a problem when you aren't out in the forest anymore, or the grasslands, or the ocean, and all that's around you is artificial. If you're surrounded by artifice, then you weave yourself into the artifice, and thereby you unweave your connections to the nature around the artifice. See what I mean? The exact same idiotism can be incredibly adaptive or incredibly maladaptive, depending on the world you're walking around in. What are we weaving when we exercise our gnosis? Because we're going to weave something, because that's what gnosis does. It's going to form a whole. Joseph, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes. So I'm assuming this like weaving in and this primal psychology is kind of like that we're becoming part. This is the very thing that doesn't allow us to challenge the underlying principles that govern society, essentially. So I always think about this in terms of kind of like how we think of in economics.
Yes.
Like certain things, that there are certain principles that are just givens.
Yes.
Like especially when we're talking about monetary, in monetary terms, what it means. So this kind of weaving into the system that we kind of can't even imagine something even different, that when we're talking about medians of exchange or things like that, or working towards regenerative systems.
That's right.
So it's because we're weaved into this, and we kind of, and it's formed us.
Yeah.
So it's it's very interesting, because this kind of, and in a way this leads to a tribal type of a belief system too. It's like kind of, it's the basis for tribalism.
Oh yeah, we're tribal. There's no question. That's that longing for culture, that longing to weave yourself into the larger whole, that goes hand in hand with forming groups.
Yeah. So no, this is an interesting paragraph, or a couple of paragraphs as well.
Yeah.
You could start to see how some of the underlying premises never get challenged, and especially within universities or things like that.
Yes.
Especially that. I hate to say that. But anyway, I hope I didn't insult any professors or anybody like that.
Thanks, Joseph. So about that, there's a couple of, what we're going to discover is that these two faculties, gnosis and noesis, they both do a kind of weaving, but gnosis does the more straightforward weaving to make you feel like and experience part of the larger whole. But the Stephen H. quote that's one of Kenneth's favorites. We'll come back to that. So gnosis does the more straightforward weaving. The thing to understand, though, is that we aren't born with just one faculty. There isn't one kind of thinking. We have three kinds of thinking. We're born with one, but born with it in a way that it undoes itself. Our gnosis not only builds a whole, but unravels the whole, because we experience the problems with that weaving, why it's not always good to be woven into the larger whole. We experience the pain of the connection, not just the joys of the connection. We experience the discomforts of doing what comes naturally to our body, as well as the comforts that come with it. And as a result, Hegel makes this point very clearly, and Smith draws off it as well, that our noesis develops as a rejection of our gnosis, right? The whole that we're forming satisfies us intensely and also dissatisfies us just as intensely. You know what I mean? I mean, you could imagine a utopia. We can imagine a utopia, but when we actually try, this is a theme Stephen comes back to regularly, and I'm going to harp on it now. It's exact, make the point that he makes. When we actually try to carry out our utopia, it does not please us, right? All of our attempts at utopias do not work. And that is very important to our ability to develop as human beings. The first utopia is the family and the relationship with your parents. And in many ways, you're utterly dependent upon it and it pleases you. But in other ways, it doesn't please you at all, right? They don't feed you when you want to be fed. They don't give you a drink when you're thirsty. They don't change your clothes right after you poop yourself. I mean, there's this gap. And they often don't know what's wrong with you. They don't know you need to be burped. Why is he crying? And they might be having a breakdown because you've been crying for hours, right? There's all kinds of dissatisfactions that are intensely powerful dissatisfactions that are part of being woven into that relationship, along with the satisfactions. And the dissatisfaction causes us to develop our noesis. The faculty's there from birth, but it isn't developed at first. But through the dissatisfactions, we begin to negate, says Hegel, parts of our whole forming gnosis. We begin to reject parts of it, and we begin to try to look for alternatives. We start planning. We start remembering and planning and thinking on the basis of, well, maybe this relationship can be salvaged. I just need to figure out how to communicate better which thing that I want, right? The language driving impulse in us, right, is partly driven by, no, mommy, feed me now. I need to learn to say no. And I need to learn to say, my brother Rob, when he was nursing, had the unfortunate habit of calling out at the top of his prodigious lungs when he was a little tyke on the bus, "Booby!" Mom used to always tell this story about how humiliating it was. Going down the buses in Seattle, and they were gonna say, "Oh, what a cute baby," and he'd go, "Booby!" And she's like, "Oh God." Meanwhile, everybody on the bus is going. But for him, the noesis involved was powerful because he could make his dissatisfactions known and alter the relationship, or he could try to alter the relationship so that the gnosis would result in a better whole than it would have if he hadn't spoken up, right? The development of abstract signaling and logic and systems and planning, it necessarily grows out of the gnosis. And at first, it functions as a form of a way to resolve the problems of idiotism, because you're rejecting parts of the idiotism that aren't pleasing, right? The immersion isn't fully working, and so you start rejecting and making new plans. The problem for us is it becomes a new form of idiotism. It becomes focused on rejecting the gnosis, but embracing the new systems that you're building and the schemas. And thus, in the modern world, we become hyper-noetic to the point that we want to follow the laws and we want to succeed economically following the mathematics of the marketplace, and on and on and on and on. Our models for ourselves and everything else all end up becoming noetic, and we merge into a larger whole that is an artificial whole instead of a natural whole. And thus, naive noesis becomes a second form of idiotism, when it began as a form of liberation from the first form of idiotism. This is what Hegel gets into and Kenneth gets into. And when he says here, this idiotism, is human nature or primal psychology, he's alluding to these two fundamental forms of idiotism that are both built into the metabolism of our mind. And the one begins as an escape from the other before becoming its own alternative form of idiotism. There is a horrible paradox here. I'll come back to this, but first, let's call on Donald because he's got his hand up.
Yeah, I think like a lot of the first part of the Republic is Plato's deidification agenda in the education of the guardians.
Yes.
They can't have families. They don't have economic activity.
Yes.
They just train, study,
yes,
whatever. So I think we'd have a lot fewer people running for public office in this country if they had to abandon their ties to the economy,
Yes.
abandon their ties to their family.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it's nepotism is a form of idiocy.
Yes.
You know, tribalism.
Sure.
All these. So you say at the end, and Plato's really writing after the fall of Athens.
Yeah.
You know, that philosophically, they're trying to make, well, how would we get real aristocrats?
Yes. Instead of what we had.
Yeah. How would we produce people that aren't idiots? Because we're not getting, nature is not just giving them to us.
Right.
You know, we have to do some work. And that's why I think it's why we can't have nice things.
Yes. Thank you, Donald. You know, I've talked before about the idea that the Greeks were trying to be about nature, but they were one of a cycle of epochs, the ancients were, within a larger circle, which was colonizer culture. And I don't mean colonizer like just going places and moving in. I mean conquering and setting up caste systems and class systems so that other people do the work for you so that you could specialize and just rule. The Greeks had a tug of war between to what extent were they going to owe their allegiance to nature the way that they claimed to do, and to what extent were they going to owe their allegiance to the system of society that allowed them to dominate others and become rich. And because they tried to equate the two, they ended up with perverse incentives. So the aristocrats got more money and social standing than everybody else did. And as a result, people wanted to become aristocrats for the wrong reasons. They were angry and wanted to tell other people what to do. They, had been impoverished and they wanted to be rich. They were despised and they wanted to be admired. These are all corrupt motivations, to use the terminology from the TV show The Good Place, right? And so because of those motivations, you end up with the wrong people in charge. And because human beings have this astonishing capacity for role-playing, you end up with Douloi and Banausoi in charge, who nevertheless could role-play an Aristos, right? They put on the airs of an Aristos. They call themselves an Aristos. They get other people to call them an Aristos. They would mimic the outward forms of an Aristos, and on and on and on. And as a result, it camouflaged their true nature to justify their aristocratic position within their society. And thus you end up with a society that doesn't understand why things are going wrong. How are they getting into these idiotic messes that they're getting into? They can't quite see that they're being ruled by idiots who are role-playing Aristoi, right? And that would have happened a great deal less if there hadn't been a huge amount of political, social, and economic rewards that came to Aristoi, or people who claim to be Aristoi. If to be an Aristos was to live like Diogenes the Cynic, you better believe you wouldn't get a huge flood of Douloi and Banausoi desperate to become Aristoi. They didn't want to live in a barrel, right? I mean, that was not going to be appealing to them. You might then be able to distinguish the Aristoi a little bit more from the rest of the people, but you can't do it as long as you're heaping all of these extraneous rewards upon whoever's in charge. But heaping rewards on who's in charge was part of colonizer culture, even though it doesn't make sense from an heuristic standpoint. And so this was the tug of war the Greeks were in. So which are we going to be? Are we going to be this caste system, or are we going to have Aristoi? You can't have both, as they discovered to their dismay. Phil, go ahead.
To comment on what Donald said, I wonder whether you could even disengage from the idiocy in this sense. And there's two reasons. One reason is, in a sense, to be that disengaged, you would become no longer a human being, because we do have certain basal drives. For instance, like the Catholic Church, presumably you can't become a priest or nun unless you divorce yourself from the earthly needs of whatever procreation. So they became all sorts of things happen that shouldn't have happened. So I just wonder that's the first criticism is, can you even disengage? Now, maybe there's a few exceptions, and to find those exceptions, and yet they say they really truly are disengaged. But can you find them without being idiots in other ways? The second reason is that I'm thinking, if you have such a disengaged person, could they ever have the kind of degree of empathy they have for others who remains idiots, and yet you have to take care of them? I mean, there has to be a degree of compassion for the idiots that remain. Unless you go to the extreme, let's just line them up and shoot them all because they don't deserve to be whatever, right? So I mean, so that becomes a problem, because I think you have to have, because I think part of that idiocy, it does involve a certain degree of, I think, feeling for others and a feeling for being with others, which produces that. And so I just wonder whether I will want that person who's essentially so abstracted that they actually are connected to some other beings that are in the world suffering from all the things that they impose upon them. So I just do not know. So therefore I just question whether that system even can exist, except in abstract, like, oh, wouldn't that be great if we could have that? Yeah, but once you have that, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, in some ways they kind of had that, right? I mean, there was many royal courts that they had what do you call it, eunuchs. I mean, like, they would, well, they're incapable of doing
cut off
things
from worldly concerns.
Right, exactly. Except they turned their passions into other things. It just became horrible.
Yes.
So I just wonder. So
how much of Chinese dynastic history is disasters driven by the eunuchs in court, right?
Right.
There's this whole thing.
Thank you for bringing up the Chinese.
Well,
we have to.
Phil, as I've expressed to Rick, I don't think Plato was successful.
Yeah, right. No,
I think he shows it's more impossible than he shows this is how you do it.
Yeah. And our other challenge is that we don't really understand what an Aristos would look like. Certainly, Kenneth Smith makes this point repeatedly. Any Aristoi that might happen to exist or might have a genetic predisposition to being Aristoi, assuming that's even how it works, which it might not be. But suppose that there were. There's no place for them in the modern world. So they live broken, crippled lives, right? They either mash themselves into the form of a doulos, or they mash themselves into the form of a benausos, and they're not satisfied or happy. So they, fall prey to mental illness and addiction and escapism and anything they can. Or they just end up in an insane asylum or homeless, because there just isn't anywhere for people to live an aristic life in the modern world. As a result, if we try to imagine what a society would be like in which Aristoi play a major role, all we can do is look around at the people available to us as models and go, well, I don't want any of these in charge. I mean, none of it, nobody I see around me, including in the mirror, has any business, running a government, or let alone doing the other things that Aristoi are supposed to do. So we can't get there from here with any kind of direct visualization, or when they say visualize world peace on a bumper sticker, we can't visualize an aristic society because we've just got no examples to work from. We'd have to get there step by step. And the only examples that we see in antiquity offer hints of what an Aristos might be like, but they're tangled up with what it means to be an oligarch, right? Because of the class societies that they had. That we're seeing people who are a blending of heuristic impulses and perverse incentives, and it creates distortion. So again, we're still not seeing real Aristoi at work, even though ancient Greek, especially Athens, but even some of the other city-states were far more welcoming to Aristoi than we are, far more conducive conditions. They were still deeply distorted and warped. This is part of my critique on top of Kenneth's. And so we're still not really seeing what the possibilities are. It's like that perfect Marxist government, right? We've never seen one. We don't know what it would look like. But what we do know is none of the things we've seen claiming to be that could possibly be what that is. So, where does that leave us? I'll come back to this in a moment, but first I'm going to call on Sharon because she got her hand up.
So I have a comment and a question.
Yeah, shoot.
We keep talking about idiocy. I do not think this is the universal nature of man or the universal nature of a society. Because in the third paragraph down, the Greeks recognized it, and they say they came to invent philosophy and science precisely because of their heightened sense of that universally human liability to believe what one already wants to believe, and that is to say, the delusional potentiality of thought and culture.
Right.
And that delusional potentiality, as I put in the chat, not just applies to culture, but it applies to your very physical existence. And having been a physician, I see it all the time. So that's why I recognize that it is primal psychology in acting.
Yeah.
But I also want to ask if I think there are, one of the weaknesses of a democracy, and I think Aristotle talked about this, and when I first started, I read it, is that the people are not adequately informed to make an appropriate choice.
Right.
And this is where this comes into it, I think. You can correct me about this, Rick. But the Aristoi that we keep talking about, and if you look at all forms of government, Marxism, like Phil's talking about, democracy, the masses are ruled by the powerful few, right? Or those that have insight, right? And those that don't insight are what I call the idiota, as idiomata, as Kenneth Smith calls it. But I don't think it's a universal condition, and I keep getting that. So correct me if I'm wrong.
So yeah, let's talk about it. When he says it's a universal condition, he doesn't mean it in a sense of the law of the excluded middle. You either are or you're not. He means that it's part of the baseline psychological makeup of our mind, and that the question isn't whether you've got idiocy. The question is, what do you do about that idiocy? It's just like, I can't fly, but I could make a plane. And the plane could act as a prosthesis to fly for me. Now, I can't remember perfectly what I did on different days, but I can have a computer with a computerized schedule that can remember for me. Part of what makes Homo sapiens interesting is that we're a tool user. And the tool use acts as prostheses to make up for our limitations and compensate for them. So it's possible, and I'm not saying tools are necessarily the primary mechanism. Culture, like I was suggesting earlier, acts like one of these prostheses that fills in the gap in our instincts. So you could use prostheses to compensate for the idiocy and help us to be aware of it and to take it into account and to work around it and to try to make a workable society. This is what the Greeks thought. And I think it's what Kenneth Smith thinks as well. But the problem is that only works if you recognize that you've got the idiocy. The moment you start thinking, well, that guy's an idiot, but I have common sense. Now you've fallen prey to the law of the excluded middle, and it means you're going to fall prey to your own idiocy because you don't think you have any, right? This is the thing about it. It's like with racism. If we recognize that racism isn't just a personal failing, but is something that we've grown up in a racist society, then we can recognize how the best way to move forward on racism isn't to just sort people into the racist people and the non-racist people and demonize the racist people and pat ourselves on the head for not being among them. But it's instead to say, you know, if we've all got some racism in us that's manifesting itself, we can watch for it. And we can watch for opportunities to do better in our own behavior, knowing that it's there. The example I look at it in my own life is alcoholism. Now, I've never been a practicing alcoholic, but I can look around my family and tell I don't need to practice even once to know that I'm an alcoholic. All of the adults in my family were. So, you know, I can compensate for the alcoholism that's inside of me behaviorally to make up for the problems it would have caused me. Idiocy is harder than that because it's not just about one thing. It's about everything. But if I know it's there and I know I have that habit, I can start to create a little bit of, I can cultivate my character and start to create a little bit of freedom of action by making informed choices, knowing my liability to make foolish ones. That's kind of what he means here. He doesn't mean, oh, well, we're idiots and we're doomed and haha, let's all give up. So go ahead. Got to come off.
It is because this is such a range throughout the period of time, which civilizations achieved functional balance. Anyone of them? Because I don't know any history that will tell me that.
Yeah, you know, and this is one of the things that's hard in studying history is that, you know, modern forms of history on the surface claim that they don't make value judgments anymore. They claim that was a medieval approach to history, and we don't do that. Now we just objectively, more objectively than any people in the history of the world, we just objectively say what happened. But the truth is, we don't know most of what happened. We don't know what it was like to live in those societies. Even the ones we know existed, we might know the names of some kings and some battles and be able to describe some things, but we still couldn't tell you what a day in the life was like for the average person in that society and what they had to deal with. So it's hard for us looking backwards to try to figure out who did a good job and who didn't do a good job because we don't know what the circumstances were like. But, you know, part of what this analysis of kind of human history, human psychology, idiotism, and so forth is designed to do is to give us more tools to use so that we could look at our own circumstances and say, well, what are some improvements we could make now based on what we're learning from these things? And one of them would be to study the nature of idiotism and how it expresses itself within us so that we can then say, maybe we should take that into account when we're designing our political system or our economic system or other things. Maybe we shouldn't pretend that we're angels of reason who see everything exactly the way it is. Maybe instead of enlightened self-interest, instead of the reasonable person theory, we need new theories that say, what would a confused idiot do here? What would somebody who's very motivated by their feelings and experiences do here? Versus what would a hyper-intellectual who's obsessed with certain ideologies do here? And say the law and our economy and so forth need to be structured in such a way that it works for people like that, because those are the people we are, right? A society that's not designed to handle those kinds of people isn't actually handling anybody well. It's only handling the imaginary, reasonable person, you know, that it postulates that we are. And that's where so many things go wrong, right? We say, well, they couldn't have done it because they were confused. They must have done it because they chose evil, and therefore we must punish the evil out of them to make them choose differently next time. A great deal of our justice system is built around the idea that people are choosing bad behavior. And so, you know, we need to make them choose something else. When in fact, many people do things wrong because they never made a choice in the first place. They just didn't understand what was happening to them and they were confused. You know, a kid touches a hot stove and burns their hand, you don't beat them and tell them they chose badly and next time they need to choose better. You know, you comfort their burned hand and then you try to teach them a little bit about stoves and burning, you know, why you should avoid it. It's a different approach to governing people if you have some compassion for the struggles that they're going through to try to understand themselves and their place in the world. This is when Phil was talking about an Aristos, and being distanced. This is one of the things that distinguishes a Banausos from an Aristos. A Banausos can be abstracted. A Banausos could say, I don't feel anything for those people, and I believe that a perfect justice system shouldn't have any feelings, because Banausos are terrified of their feelings, right? They work so hard to push away the gnosis of the dualic condition. Now they take great pride in being what they imagine a Vulcan is. I will rationally, logically deduce the proper society, and justice will be blind, and I will dish out my judgments and punishments without any concern for who you are as people. And they think that that's justice because they're Banausoid. They don't understand that in disregarding human feeling and compassion, they're not making a utopia, they're making a dystopia. Right? A kind of horrible machine world. So this is what I mean, Sharon, is it's sort of like, if we take the idiotism into account in a full way, the point of it is not to sort people into the good and the bad and idiots and non-idiots. And, it's also not to embrace obscurantism, to embrace the idea that it's all hopeless and we should just give up. But rather, it's to say, maybe we should structure our societies in such a way that we take into account who we really are, so that we're not constantly mistreating one another based on thinking that we're somebody that we're not. I look at the Darwin Awards. I don't know if you've ever seen those. They go around the internet, and there's Darwin Awards handed out each year for the person who removed themselves from the gene pool, who seemed to deserve it the most. They do it with like bank robbers who lock themselves into the safe and suffocate because there's no air in there. They do it's almost always criminals doing unbelievably stupid things. And, it is Banausic and maybe a little dualic to point and laugh. But a lot of these people, the reason they did such idiotic things is because on the one hand, they were desperate, and on the other, they were ignorant. And ignorant desperation isn't going to lead to good outcomes. But neither is pointing and laughing or expecting them to be something that they're not. These are people who need something other than what we're giving them in order to try to do better in life. I'm sort of shocked repeatedly. I keep thinking I've gotten used to it, and I keep being surprised by how unprepared for life most of us are. It's not just the modern world, but I mean, people who can't even manage, like most men can't manage their own feelings very well, especially anger. A huge number of men have been raised to believe that the only appropriate way to have emotions as an adult is, calmness or anger. You can terrify the bad guys, or you stay calm and don't have any feelings. But, vulnerability, like a man crying, is considered, oh God, he's a sissy, he's going to get bullied. There's all this toxic stuff we learn in the locker room. And so as a result, you end up with most of an entire gender unable to do the most basic management of their own feelings, and really struggling to figure out what to do in life as a result of that. And any number of relationships, marriages fail because of that, jobs fail because of that. It causes an enormous amount of chaos and crisis, because they're trying to be an abstract person who they aren't and are never going to succeed at being. You know what I mean? So this is kind of what I think about idiocy when it comes to this. If we know that it's in us, and if we study how it works, we can start to recognize when we're doing it, and then we can make better choices. Yeah, I cry all the time too. Not usually on these seminars, but Anyway, so let me take it back to, with that in mind, let me take it back to the text. There's a couple more things to do on this sentence that we're doing. And this was the sentence Sharon first quoted. This idiotism is human nature, a primal psychology. So we were talking about the way that gnosis is this whole forming basal metabolic mental function, right? And that it creates a form of idiocy because we are merging ourselves with the whole. And that noesis emerges as an escape from that idiocy, a rejection of it. We say, this isn't working for me. I need something different. I'm going to learn how to negate and say, no, I don't want this. Why is it the terrible two is always saying no? He's discovered noesis. No, I don't want to take a nap. No, I don't want my broccoli. I don't want to do my chores right now. He's finding he's learning to express the dissatisfactions with their gnosis. And of course, the great irony is that in the process of pulling away and remaking themselves as a noetic person, especially in a hypernoetic society like ours, they overdo it. We overdo it, and we become overly Apollonian, and we become a new kind of whole forming. We form ourselves into an abstract whole, a systematized, artificial, logical, a legal system, an economic system, the hierarchy within a business, you name it, whatever it is, we're recasting ourselves. I am a computer programmer. I don't program computers. I am a computer programmer. We become our jobs, right? We fit ourselves into these systems, except that we don't really. We think we do. We try to. We know we're supposed to be voters, and we're supposed to be consumers and producers and fans. We have all these roles laid out for ourselves that we're supposed to align ourselves with, but they don't really work. And so at that point, the irony is, and this is what informs a lot of Kenneth Smith's writing, gnosis, the whole forming, when it is experiencing the discomfort of the mismatch between ourselves and the abstract roles we're trying to fit ourselves into, including the abstract society that we're creating, instead of becoming the idiotic trap, it becomes the escape from noesis, because it's the evidence that noesis has gone wrong and our systems aren't working. This is the basis of science. We can have brilliant theories, but when we put them to the test, the real world gives us new information, not intellectualized abstract information. It gives us upsetting emotional information because we failed. This was supposed to cure cancer and it didn't. And we have feelings about that. And it's the feelings about that that help us to cast aside the theory and move on to a new theory and a new experiment, right? If we didn't care, then if the experiment failed, we could just disregard it and stick with the theory. But it's because we have a gnosic experience that ruptures the whole we had formed with our noetic theories and systems. That evidences our dissatisfaction, our displeasure, our discomfort. That shows us the limitations of noesis. So earlier, Joseph, we were talking about the irony of noesis first being a liberator and then becoming a new trap. But the real irony is gnosis, which was our original trap that we needed liberation from, becomes the liberation from our noetic systems. So the more habitualized we can make our lives, the more we can avoid the rupture of gnosis that deflates our noetic pretensions and shows us that our justice system isn't working, our economy isn't working, our voting system isn't working. But if we can just look away from all that information, if we can try to stay away from unhappy voters whose votes were thrown away, if we can look away from homeless people, if we can just extract ourselves from the gnosic information, then we can stay inside the hole that we formed with noesis. So each of these things, gnosis and noesis, is both a trap that forms a certain kind of hole and a liberator that can perform a certain kind of negation and help us get out of that trap, or help us get out of the other one's trap. There's the paradox. This is one of Heraclitus's core arguments. You know you're in the presence of phusis and its logos when things refuse to settle down into simple truths and falsehoods that exclude each other. When instead, you not only end up with a simple contradiction, but you end up with a potent, dynamic paradox in which gnosis is both one of the most powerful traps and one of the most powerful liberators at the exact same time. And the same is true of noesis. This is when we really start getting into Hegel's dialectic about the mind. They are not obeying the law of the excluded middle. They're not staying in nice, tidy, intellectualized categories. They are in dynamic relation to each other. And in that dynamic relation, each of them becomes the other in the role that we formerly thought that it had. You know, they flip-flop. Who's the trap and who's the liberator? I'm going to call on Phil, and then I'll bring this full circle and we can finish this sentence and move on to the next paragraph. I'm really milking this because he's got a lot of stuff here.
I'm wondering what you just described is this duality, is describing what I thought was the third way. You know, like, I like what Heidegger said about art. He sort of said that Plato made a mistake by seeing art as a craft.
Right.
And Heidegger thinks that art is a kind of philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like poetry is a kind of philosophy.
Yeah.
That remains, I don't know whether you could say the ambiguity, but this duality between like the being showing itself and concealing itself. So it's not giving you the whole picture. And what that does, what poetry does, and what true art is, as opposed to, let's say, arts and crafts, is that it presents a question that hints at something, but it doesn't complete it, so it remains open, what he would call open to the openness, that allows you to continue to explore the possibilities, right? Otherwise, it would just draw the conclusion. And I think he is sort of claiming that's what the original Greeks meant, is this openness to allow things to come forth. And unfortunately, when Plato reduced it to a craft, then it's a handiwork. And the way I look at it is artists have this distinction between making and finding.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to the whole relationship between Dasein. You know, like I said, you know, to really answer that question about Dasein, we have to answer the question of the clearing. Does Dasein prepare the clearing for being to expose itself? Or does he run into the clearing and being shows itself? You know, Heidegger intended to write a complete story in which he would, the first part was to explain Dasein and it's sort of like authenticity. And he did a good job completing that, although it's very difficult to read, believe me. But nonetheless, he had intended to then later on take on part B, which is to discuss what being is. Because not only Dasein approaching being, but like what is being. And I think the way he explains it, it almost seems like it's the relationship between making and finding, because the artist on the one hand is finding, but is also making.
Yes.
There's a handicraft part of it in the making to allow for the finding to take place.
Yes.
And it seems to me being is more of allowing being to be found.
Yes.
So the fact that he didn't complete that is really frustrating, because I see it as a relationship between Dasein, or you could say mankind, and being. And that relationship creates not only the idea that manifests itself in existence, but it also means that I have to understand, or try to understand, at least in part, you know, whether the finding is a pertinent part, and to what degree preparing the stage for the making, for the finding to appear, is the important part. And it just seems to be, you know, like, then I thought, oh, well, maybe he did that on purpose. Because, you know, by not writing it, he's not giving you the answer.
Right.
If he gave you the answer, it's, oh, yes, I got the whole picture.
Yeah.
You close down the opening of the opening,
That's right.
right?
That's
So
right.
so I just wonder, like, okay, or else he could just didn't do it because he was by the time he completed Being in Time, he was involved with the Nazis. It was a dangerous thing to write about being if he at that point, So I don't know. It just seems interesting what his intent was.
Yeah.
He sort of writes a little bit about it, when he wrote about art, and so that was his attempt to show the being of beings. But on the other hand, it wasn't. It was certainly not as thorough as what he's talking about Dasein. So that is, in a sense, an interesting thing, and I just wonder whether what you're explaining maps on in this relationship to the idiocy of both, and therefore you could find the third that way, or whether the third actually appears out of the exclusion of the middle, that both aspects are incomplete, and there's a third that, in a sense, I don't know where you could say they equivocate between the two, whether it's independent of the two. So I don't know. So I just thought I'd ask that question.
We're going to talk about that. I mean, you put your finger right on it there. We're going to talk about that. When you talk about the balance between making and finding, I always think of Picasso's Bull's Head, which is one of my favorite of his pieces of art. I don't know if everybody's seen it. If you haven't, you can click on the link or look it up in Wikipedia. But Bull's Head is a bicycle seat and handlebars, old ones that he found in a junkyard, and they were near each other, and his brain put them together into a bull's head before he even knew what was happening. And it was only afterwards that he looked at it and said, oh my God, you can put these together into a bull's head. And so he welded them together, and it became one of his pieces that he showed. And he had to explain to people. He said, if all you see is the bull's head, then I failed as an artist. Because what I want to show you is that the making and the finding are tangled up together, and that's art. The two things lying by themselves in a junkyard wouldn't be the art, and neither would a perfect sculpture of a bull's head. What makes this what it is that I found these things, I saw the potential, and I put them together, and now you can see the act of the artist, not in the craft, but in the moment, the epiphany of seeing that says, oh my goodness, there's something else here that I didn't see before. And now we can share that. But yes, this question of equivocation is definitely where I'm going with this opening paragraph in a moment. But first I want to call on the folks in line. James, go ahead.
Yeah, that's an interesting question about the idea of the artistic creation. You think that would come close to the Aristoid, the kind of Gnostic mind that is able to, like Dasein, bring his understanding of himself, ontology, the being that is the authentic being is the one who is in question, and is able to take on that project of self-questioning, and which, in that sense, it's kind of an Aristoid or Gnostic capability, right? To question himself. And of course, inauthentic being would be one who doesn't question himself, and maybe gets sucked into the they inauthentic idea of the self,
right?
Which Heidegger perhaps maybe is guilty of falling into. Possibly. Right. I don't know what he was thinking.
Yeah, I really need to read more Heidegger. But I think, yes, generally speaking, what the Greeks and Kenneth Smith think, what they see in the Aristos is that these two paradoxes, that gnosis is the liberator and the entrapper. It is a source of parochial idiocy, but at the same time, it can be a form of rupturing wisdom that breaks up the abstract idiocy of noesis, just like noesis can be the wisdom that breaks up the parochial idiocy of gnosis. And that the reason we have these two forms of idiocy that are incompatible with each other is that it increases the odds that they rupture each other. And thus, the very same evolutionary capacity that gives us our idiocy also gives us the antidote for the idiocy. These two half-witted faculties of the mind each have the cure for the other's ills. And the challenge is, when do you use which? Or when do you use them both together, and how do you combine them? And this is what the Aristos is supposed to do. The third Vernunft, the third form of mental activity that Hegel writes about, is what happens when your escape from gnosis into noesis is complete, but then generates its own dissatisfactions that are then ruptured in turn by gnosis enough times that you stop trying to paper it over and you start realizing that your noesis, in a completely different way, is every bit as idiotic and flawed as your naive gnosis was. That they're both a trap, but that they each also have, they're not just a form of idiocy or foolishness, they're also a form of wisdom when they're rupturing the idiocy of the other form. These two faculties are together for a reason. We evolved this way because they're complementary. They're complementary not in a comfortable find a balance in the middle way. They're complementary only in a disruptive, negating, challenging way, in which the trap of gnosis is broken when noesis negates it, and the trap of noesis is broken when gnosis, the new evidence, the new feelings, negate it. And so the third form of thought, Vernunft, what the Aristos is supposed to be doing, is when you stop giving your allegiance to either form. You stop believing that either half-witted solution is the solution to all things. And you start to understand that each one is going to offer you strengths at the price of making you the kind of idiot that it makes you. And that's why you need then to use the other one to break it up and keep it from ossifying itself into place as a trap. Keep it fluid, keep it humble, right? Your theories have to be domesticated. They can't be allowed to be totalitarian masters over you, and you domesticate them by shoving them at the world and letting the world disprove them, right? Because the world wins that argument. You could be stuck somewhere. If all you do is try to reason your way out of it and logic your way out of noesis, you could be in there forever, because noesis is infinitely adaptable. But the moment it comes up against an experience or a feeling or a memory or some other powerful gnosic elements, it ruptures when they're incompatible, and vice versa. So this dynamic, and this is the, I guess I've never really said this exactly out loud before. This dynamic tension between gnosis and noesis is the dynamic system of the bow or the lyre that Heraclitus is talking about. And it's not a comfortable tension. It's not as comfortable as either of those, because these two forces within us, gnosis and noesis, when we wield them properly, are breaking each other up all the time in order to prevent them getting ossified, in order to keep them limber, keep them adaptive. It is a different mode of thought than either one by itself. And it's a different mode of thought than the two together when one of them is master. Because every adult who is a doulos is emired in gnosis, but they still wield noesis as a tool to support their gnosis, right? They'll use noetic rationalizations to camouflage the utter gnosic basis of their beliefs. And the converse is true as well. You know, the noetic intellectual will, pick and choose theories that please them. They are wielding their gnosis to try to create a whole, an artificial whole, but a whole that they can inhabit. But in each case, they have subordinated what could have been the antidote to their labyrinth so that it serves the labyrinth. What makes Vernunft different from either Begriff or Verstand is that it doesn't let either one be master and lets them each disrupt the other so that they keep moving. Stephen, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just looking, the current big situation where we're heading for nuclear war. And you look at what the press is full of.
Yes.
And our glorious Western press are telling us that our side is going to win.
Yes.
Because we're virtuous, and we know blind nature rewards what we think of as virtue.
That's right.
And our opponent, Vlad, is an idiot.
Right.
We can't lose. Come on, boys, let's get down the trenches and beat them. We cannot lose. And I just see that many straw men when they're saying Putin's plan has failed. Why? He told you he really did tell you what his secret plan was. How do we know what plan has failed when we don't even know what his plan was?
Mm-hmm.
And when all those forces went near to Kiev, you could tell that was a feint. But now you're regarded as disloyal and evil if you tell people that was a feint, because the sheer rationale there is when you can barely take over Mariupol, how in the hell are you going to take over a city full of millions of very annoyed Ukrainians? Of course he knew.
Right.
It's not the plan. He's not going to try and take over Kiev. So this is a guy that I never expected this to happen. I expected this to happen years ago, or it's not going to happen. I thought it was going to happen, what he's doing now, 5 years ago, or whenever, 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And now I realise I haven't bothered to look at this for years. But Vladimir Putin sure as hell has been. He's been thinking about all this for the past 7 years. And this guy, I'd suspect he has a plan and he's been preparing for it for years.
Right.
And to me, it's obvious he's fighting over the subjective, not so much the objective. Everyone sees things in terms of objective territory. Right. He has to do two things. He has to alienate the Ukrainians from their own government, and he has to get the Russians fully on his side. It's the subjective he's fighting over. He has to make sure that all the Russians realise, as he has done, that the West are the bad guys. Don't trust them. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, I don't know.
Yeah, that's almost certainly part of what he's up to, I agree.
And now the scary bit is the Ukrainians are asking for missile systems that they can hit Moscow with. I mean, there's escalation and there's containment. Now, really, it'd be smarter for the West to look for containment rather than escalation. But if by any strange chance you give the Ukrainians missiles they can hit Moscow with, well, Vlad's got his birthday wish delivered to him. Suddenly the Russians will realise, oh, yeah, the West is our enemy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so much at stake right here, and I'm just going to expand on it just for a moment before going back to the text, and that is, part of the way in which he has won already is that we set up this whole global economic system in which we claim people's money is safe and they can trust us. But as soon as this war got started, we locked up his money all over the world. We locked up Russian money all over the world, thereby demonstrating that the United States cannot be trusted with other countries' money. The very first time we don't like you, we will cut off your access to those funds, which proves that the economic system that we are telling everybody to invest in is untrustworthy. It may be that, a big part of his battle is about currency and about whether the United States is going to remain as it has been for a little over, coming up on 3/4 of a century, the sort of the central repository of fiduciary trust. And he's just proven you can't trust us. Well, we proved it when we cut him off like that. Because if that's the closest that's left to a superpower other than us would be Russia and China. And if we can cut off Russia's, a nigh superpower's access to funds, then we can cut off France's access or India's access or anybody else's access, which makes them all over the world. All these countries are looking at the United States very differently than they were a year ago. And we mostly aren't reporting about it in our press because we're not very comfortable with that line of discussion. But we'll come back to it. There's always more going on than what our propaganda tells us is going on in every case. Whether we're the good guys or the bad guys or somewhere in between or neither or both, there's always more going on. Sharon, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that as I listened to Stephen talk about the West's perception of the Ukrainian war, it has a lot to do with what we're talking about, the cognitive dissonance of the culture.
Yes.
Because I was in Europe a couple of weeks ago and listened to some German generals talk, and Ukraine, and the general consensus was that Ukraine is going to lose that war. No matter what propaganda we are being told in the United States. So we come right back to the central point that you are making here, about what the cultures think and therefore how they behave.
Exactly. What a good point, Sharon. Thank you. Yeah, so now that we've talked through the whole cycle of the growth out of the begriff, the naive gnosis, the way it becomes a whole forming trap, the way that noesis begins as a liberator that ruptures it until it becomes a second whole forming trap and a generalizing, abstractivized, systematizing one. And then finally, gnosis allows us to rupture that back. And when we come to understand we can't trust either one, we can start to engage in Vernunft, which is the mode of thought that defines an Aristos. That more than anything else, more than a social role, more than all the other measurements we might look for, it is the use of the equivocation, to use Phil's term, the equivocation, the unwillingness to put ourselves entirely in the camp of one or the other of the baseline metabolic faculties of our mind, the insistence to equivocate between them and use them against each other so that we can be free of both of them and maintain a limber mind. That is one of the fun, that's the only time we domesticate our idiotism to the point where we are not always an idiot, only most of the time when we aren't paying attention, right? What an Aristos has that nobody else has is not that they are never an idiot. They're still usually an idiot, and they're still powerfully driven by two different idiotizing forces within them, but they're learning to play them off against each other and use them to break each other up to create moments of non-idiocy that can then thereafter act as guideposts for us. Even, once we've established a principle through Vernunft, we can later use the idiocy of gnosis and the idiocy of noesis to align them to that goalpost. We can align for emotional reasons, or we can align for intellectualized systematic reasons. Both gnosis and noesis can be harnessed to something like that. It then becomes part of our internal culture, and our internal culture has changed. You see what I mean? This is what they thought an Aristos's job was with regard to themselves, is this constant transformation of their inner mythology by using moments of Vernunft to set up new frames of reference that the two forms of idiocy could then work within. And thus, the two forms of idiocy are now better aligned with the world than they were before that happened. So over time, incrementally, through these aha moments and epiphanies, if you harness them right, you can become a more functional idiot, and your idiocy can become less of a problem. To go back to the discussion we had with Sharon and I had earlier today, it's not a damnation to hell or futility or nihilism or anything else to acknowledge that we're idiots, so long as we develop our strategy for how we can live our lives in ways that reduce our idiocy over time and make us more effective. Sonny, you got your hand up. Go ahead and come off mute and let's talk.
Actually, I have no opinion because
okay.
you guys so advanced in philosophy, but I just would like to know that Shannon lately talk about one thing, said there's a general talk about Ukraine about lose the war. I'd like to know Shannon's opinions, if you have.
Oh yeah.
Your own Sharon's own opinion, if you have.
No, I do not have a personal opinion. I said I visited Germany recently and was fortunate enough to listen to a discussion among a few ex-military, they were generals, German generals, and this was their opinion. And it was based on the political factors and some of the geographic pitfalls that they outline. I don't have any opinion. I wish we didn't have a war there, but I am not informed enough to come up with an opinion on whether Ukraine is going to win or lose the war. From a personal point of view, the human carnage is just tremendous. And that's my biggest angst.
Yeah. I'm with you.
Actually, we whole world will pay the price because Ukrainian people, the number one, they are 25% of the populations are dislocated. 15% of people are become refugee.
Yes.
And the biggest city, every biggest city except Kiev, Russia don't want to destroy because it's their monument things. Other cities are bombed. And the whole world, because the cooking oil, 50% is produced by Russia and Ukraine. So and the gas, the Europe 40% gas from Ukraine. So the inflation cannot avoid. We pay the price. Everyone pay the price.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And Ukraine that is the number one loser. Sure. Yeah.
So can I just make one comment to that? And I think this fits in with this afternoon's discussion. I think that this conflict in Ukraine is repetitive.
Yeah.
Right? We've been here before, right? And so when Rick talks about our ability to have insight and understand and refrain from repetitive behavior, I think we're killing each other. But it almost looks like the gathering storm, and I'm pretty young enough for World War II. It almost looks like the gathering storm, because if any of the surrounding countries, Poland, Sweden, become NATO allies, then this guy, Putin, we're going to enrage him. And, he's not to lose. So, it sets up a very tense dynamic. And you're right, there are no winners. It's a war.
Yeah. So for the moment, thanks for bringing that up,
They
Sonny.
are winner. We, Canada, Americans, we are winner. But for humanity, it's more than win or lose. It's about should we take care of the human livelihood.
Thank you, Sonny. I'm gonna take us back to the text, but I'm glad you brought that up because it does, like Sharon said, it does tie directly into today's discussion, especially the fact that in the United States, although we supposedly have a diversity of media sources, almost everybody in the United States hears the same overall story, which is that Russia's going to lose and Ukraine is the underdog and they're going to win and we'll help them win. Whereas in other places like Germany, you get these experienced people who are like, well, there's no real basis in reality for that. I don't know why Americans all think that, except that is their culture. It is our culture as Americans to believe that, even if there isn't evidence to suggest it. I too don't know how this is going to end. I have no opinion about that. I'm not informed enough. I don't know if anybody is. I don't know if anybody who's even the people who are making this happen. I don't know if any of them really know how this is going to come out either. But what we can see in this, it's an opportunity to observe the ways in which our opinions are being formed more by our culture than by the information that's actually out there in the world. our cultural predispositions, just like Kenneth Smith says in this paragraph, are shaping us so profoundly that we believe we're living in the real world and describing the way things actually happen, when what we're actually doing is manifesting our own culture's presuppositions. What did he say here? He said, envelopes of cultural consensus, as if these constituted truth itself. That's what we're inhabiting. So Donald, and then Phil, and then I'll take us back to the text to wrap us up for today.
Yeah, I don't think it's a failing of philosophy that it has no answer or profound insight into a war between Russia and Ukraine. That's not the kind of wisdom, I think, that philosophy provides. I mean, even Athens selected their generals not on their philosophical acumen, but on their warfighting ability. I think we can be assured that the strong do as they will and the weak suffer what they must. We just don't know in advance which are the strong and which are the weak. We'll find that out if we keep going in the Ukraine.
Thank you, Donald. For those who don't know, he was quoting Thucydides there, which Thucydides' critique of history is saying that he wasn't seeing evidence of the forces of justice manifesting in Greek history. What he was seeing is the strong doing what they would and the weak suffering what they must. And that was, when you consider that Thucydides was an Athenian, and you think, if Athens were America and Thucydides were writing the history of the war, he would be self-aggrandizing. He would be describing the glories of Athens and how they were right and their enemies were wrong. But instead, here's Thucydides right at the outset of his book going, this war is stupid and it sucks. Basically, this is a philosophical way of saying this war is stupid and it sucks. And we're not seeing justice at work. We're just seeing might makes right, which isn't good. It's one of my favorite Thucydides quotes of all time. And it gets quoted a fair amount in popular culture too. Phil, go ahead.
Well, I am going to go back to Ukraine.
Okay.
Because I do believe I have some insight into this. The real problem is the Ukraine rests on an important piece of land. And that piece of land is necessary both for Russia and for Europe, and of course for Ukraine. It lies on the European plain, which has been a path through which Europe, certainly from Napoleon to Hitler, has moved through to attack Russia. And also Europe has always been afraid that the Soviet Union, Russia, could just move through the European plain. And the people you need to observe the most in this context is Poland. Because after Ukraine, the European plain, the Russian has to move through Poland in order to get to the point where they could defend themselves. And so that means that neither side can give up. And hopefully there will be some sort of peace settlement of some sort. Because the real tragedy in here is not the Americans and the Canadians or even the Europeans, except maybe Poland, of course, Ukraine, but because the food producing production of Ukraine, along with Russia, is so important that the poor people in the world, and some people might estimate in the millions, perhaps tens of millions. I've heard figures even hedging to maybe 1 billion people might starve to death because of the result, not of direct conflict with the war, but the fact that the grains necessary, certainly in the Middle East, which depends on that, on the wheat, will not be there.
Yeah.
and they would not be able to afford to buy it because the rich country could at least cobble it together. And in addition, like what happened is this is laid on top of the fact that the falling economies throughout the world has been overextended. It's going to fall apart, which means the purchasing power and the economy is going to fall apart, which adds to that problem. So unless this is settled in some way, also there's a fertilizer. I mean, both Russia and Ukraine are areas that produce a lot of fertilizer, which means that if you don't get the fertilizer in time, you cannot have the kind of yield, even in other parts of the world, to sustain enough production to feed the rest of the world, because we have only been able to feed the rest of the world because of the industrial production and the scientific revolution in terms of transferring fertilizer, which we dig and use up, but nonetheless is not. So we're caught in a funny position simply because we have extended the population to such a degree that, like it's really on the edge, even in good times. But now, what let's say 20-30% of the grains in the world will not be there. And the supply line is broken up, which means people are going to die, not you and me, but people are going to die. It's a question of how many. So that is the big tragedy, even more than the people that are being killed in Ukraine. So let's hope something could end up to some degree of satisfaction. The problem is neither side want to give up.
Thank you, Phil. Go ahead, Sharon. Come off mute.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something very important that both the generals agreed on. These are retired generals. And they talked about a place, NATO must be prepared to defend its weakest point, the Suwalki corridor. And I never heard about that before. And this is the Polish-Lithuanian border. And we could probably look it up. And they said, if Russia seizes that as they try to move their troops into Ukraine, then we're going to have World War III, because then NATO would be forced to defend its territory.
Well, you could see why Poland is the most supportive of Ukraine, refusing all sorts of refugees, because they know that they are the next coming, and they really want to defend, because that corridor is the vulnerability.
That corridor is of significant vulnerability, and it was like a trigger point. That's the most important thing I learned from the hour and a half of listening to them. I never heard of that corridor before, and they spoke extensively about it.
So, I've mentioned before that recent advances in genetic archaeology have revealed that people in Europe, only white people in Europe are recent. We didn't get there until very recently. We colonized Europe. We started out in a culture north of the Caucasus Mountains, in the region between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, on the plains there, where we mixed with a couple of other groups. That created the Yamnaya culture. And they were a caste society of pastoral agriculturalists who were patriarchal, and they worshiped sky gods, and they were military. And wherever they went, they conquered and set up class systems. They went east and they set up what became the Hindi system of caste system of India. They went through Central Europe and South, and they went east. And when they went east, they went over the top of the Black Sea, right? The Ukraine is where they came through, and they settled on the west coast of the Black Sea. They were there for hundreds of years, and when they eventually moved into Europe, starting around 3500 BCE, they took two paths, and one of them was up the Danube Valley, which took a long time. It took over 1,000 years to go up the Danube Valley and come out the other side into Northwest Europe. The other path they took was the corridor you're discussing. They went up through what's today's Poland and went up into the Baltic regions and across the North Sea. So that is how That's how white people got into Europe to start with, was through those two corridors. And it's not surprising that we're seeing it in the news again, because the geology has not changed. Where the mountains are, where the passes are, it's the same things determining us. And this takes us back to Heraclitus and the Greeks, that ultimately nature frames us and shapes us in profound and powerful ways, even when we have no idea that that's going on. So why don't we wrap up here for this week, and we'll pick up next week with the second paragraph, and I think we'll make better progress. The first paragraph is just so rich, and it introduces so many ideas. It was going to take us a while to get through that, but I really wanted today to tie that back to the first section and show how we're still talking about nature. We've just now moved from the nature outside of us to the nature that's inside of us.
Is that custom and nature section?
So this is section B.
Custom and nature, yes.
Yeah, custom and nature, aristocracy and philosophy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Despite the fact that we ended up in Ukraine, thank you very much anyways.
Quite all right.
But I think it's
Thank
very,
you,
I
Rick.
think it was extremely relevant. Thank you
Yes,
very much,
it is.
Rick.
Yes, it was. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
No.
Eh,
For some of you that
Can of worms, sure.
for
Go
some
ahead,
of
Donna.
you that like military history, Erich von Manstein wrote his memoirs, and he was the general in charge, the field marshal in charge of Army Group South that went through the Ukraine and took the Crimea. And he describes it as he was forced to fight a certain kind of battle, but he said it's actually should have been a sea battle. It's it's like fighting in Kansas,
What does that mean?
Well, that is, in some cases you try to hold a position. In other cases, your objective is to destroy enemy forces. And that's the way the Navy fights. But the Army usually fights with defensive, trying to take ground and hold it.
Right.
And he said he had to hold so much worthless ground that he got spread out so thin that wasn't as effective as it could have been. But there were, if you want to know about a big war in the Ukraine, he's the last guy that fought one there, and he wrote a book on it. So it's kind of interesting,
What's his name?
Erich von Manstein.
Erich von Manstein.
Yeah, ERICHVONMANSTEIN. It's called Forgotten Victories or something like that.
All right. Thanks again.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
That was pretty awesome. Thank you, Rick.